Something in the Forest. Written by Andre Paulin. Narrated by Janika DeMonico. Something in the Forest. The Black Hollow Case. Edge of Quiet. I pulled the rental to a stop near Town Hall and cut the engine. I'm Mara Sullivan, a private investigator called up from the county to review Black Hollow's disappearances. Town Hall had scheduled an intake. I planned to start with the official files and Sheriff Hank Calder's reports. The silence that followed was the first real clue something was systematically wrong. Not the silence of a quiet morning. I'd grown up near enough to small towns to recognize that particular kind of peace. The natural lull of a place where people moved through their days without urgency. This was different. It was the silence of people who knew they were being watched and had agreed, without speaking, to keep it. I sat with my hands on the wheel. The air smelled of damp evergreen and earth, the kind of clean smell that usually meant peace. Usually. I zipped my jacket against the chill and stepped out, my notebook heavy with preliminary findings. 3 missing over 4 months, 2 bodies recovered from the surrounding forest, no clear pattern or connections. I'd read the files twice on the drive, and the lack of coherence bothered me more than any obvious pattern would have. The town looked prosperous in a carefully maintained way. Main Street had shops with clean windows, houses sat behind manicured yards. Even the memorial wall by the church, its list of surnames and dates, spoke of order and record-keeping. Everything was in its place, accounted for. My eyes caught the town boundary, a wall of river rock topped with carved posts, each bearing a simple rune, the Edge Wall. I'd read enough about the Edge Accord to know townspeople maintained it monthly, a written covenant that regulated behavior at the forest line. On paper, it sounded like practical forestry management, reasonable, organized. I walked closer, my shoes crunched on gravel. The posts were weathered but well kept, the runes carved deep and deliberate. The wall ran along the boundary like a line drawn in the earth. In person, it felt like something else entirely. The walk back to Town Hall took longer than it should have. My mind kept circling the edge wall, the deliberate runes, the monthly maintenance, the way it stood like a statement rather than a barrier. I needed to see the official records. Whatever the town was hiding would be documented somewhere, filed in the kind of bureaucratic order small towns maintain with almost religious precision. The records counter sat in the main hallway, a long desk with a nameplate. Marion Keyes, records clerk. Marion Keyes, the long-serving records clerk, was behind it, a woman in her 60s, her posture shaped by decades in the same chair. Her gray hair was pulled back, and her cardigan was buttoned despite the mild air. I approached the counter. Records on missing persons, the last few months. Marion's eyes didn't change. She'd been expecting this. "I'll need to see your credentials," she said, voice even but not unkind. I showed her my ID. She examined it as if memorizing it, then set it on the counter. 3 cases, she said, fingers already on the filing drawer. Devin Hart, Jordan Michaels, Casey Winters. Missing since January 15th, February 8th, and March 3rd, respectively. I leaned forward. Dates precise, names spelled correctly. Last seen locations, descriptions, circumstances. It was all perfectly accurate, which made it worse. 2 of them turned up dead, she said quietly. One near the eastern slope clearing, the other about 2 miles northeast of town. She stared past me at something on the wall. No witnesses, no weapons, nothing to suggest an abduction. Her words sounded scripted, memorized until hollow. No weight, no hesitation, no sense of real people behind them. "How long have you been a clerk here?" I asked. 23 years. "And in that time, how many cases like this have you filed?" She blinked, the first change in her expression. "These are the first in 23 years, she said, the number small in her mouth. I turned back to the folder. Handwriting neat, entries complete. Everything a proper investigation should contain. But Marion's flat, rehearsed voice suggested something else. The town had agreed on a story, and Marion was its first teller. "Can I get copies of these?" I asked. "Of course," she said, rising to the copier. Her movements were efficient, practiced. She didn't speak or look back. She made the copies, placed them in a folder, and returned to the counter. "Anything else?" I wanted to ask what she knew, why her voice sounded like someone reading lines at a town meeting that had already decided the truth, but I didn't, not yet. "No," I said, taking the folder. "This is helpful. Thank you." Marion nodded. I turned to leave and heard the soft click of the filing cabinet drawer closing and Marion settling back into her chair, waiting for the next person who would ask questions she'd already answered 1,000 times in her head. The folder felt thin as I left town hall, lighter than it should be for answers that mattered. I walked to my rental car. The spring air that had seemed clean that morning now carried something else, a staleness like a room left closed too long. The Hart residence on Maple Street sat back from the road with a wraparound porch that needed paint. I'd pulled the address from the preliminary file. Devin Hart, age 28, missing since late February. I sat in the car a moment, reviewing what Marion had given me. 3 names, 3 disappearances spread across 4 months, 2 bodies, no connections listed, no theories offered. Lila Hart answered before I'd finished knocking. She was younger than I'd expected, mid-20s, paint-stained fingers, hazel eyes that didn't look away. She held herself sharply, a readiness that suggested she'd been waiting for someone like me. "Look, you're the investigator," she said, not a question. "Mara Sullivan. I'm looking into the disappearances. I'd like to talk about Devin if you're willing." She stepped back and let me in. The living room was small and lived in, books stacked on the coffee table, a half-finished canvas propped against a wall. Lila gestured to the couch and sat across from me in a chair by the window. "Devin didn't just vanish into thin air," she said before I opened my notebook. "Everyone wants to pretend Devin left on their own, but Devin wouldn't bail without telling me. We're close. We tell each other everything." I wrote the date and time. "Tell me what happened before Devin went missing." Lila's jaw tightened. "Devin got pulled off the Spring Festival committee. No reason. Then a town contract. Devin was promised that job, and it got handed to someone else. After that, folks treated Devin like they'd been told to. At the store, at church, quiet shunning. It moved through town like a rumor." "Who started it?" "There wasn't one starter. It spreads. One person decides. Other people fall in line without ever saying a word." I leaned forward. "Was there a specific incident that set it off?" "There was an argument. Devin called out one of the Beckett foremen about working conditions. It was public, at the site. 3 days later, Devin stopped coming to community things. 2 weeks later, Devin was gone." "Did Devin try to leave town before disappearing? Pack anything?" "Not that I saw. Devin's room still had clothes, everything. If Devin was planning to leave, you'd see it. There were no signs." I wrote it down, aware she was watching. "People leave towns," I said, keeping it brief. "Shame and isolation do that." "No way," Lila said, flat and fast. "Devin wouldn't walk out without saying goodbye. Not to me." The certainty in her voice was absolute, but certainty wasn't evidence. I'd learned that much already. "I'll need to talk to the families of the other missing people, Jordan Michaels and Casey Winters." "They'll tell you the same thing," she said. "Social pressure, then absence, then silence. It's the same pattern." I closed my notebook. "Thank you for talking to me." She walked to the door. "Listen," she said as I stepped onto the porch. "Hank Calder, the sheriff, he won't help. He's part of this. I don't know how, but he is." I didn't respond. I had 3 more homes to visit, each with the same story. Driving away from Maple Street, I kept thinking about Lila's pattern. Removal, confrontation, absence, silence. It suggested something deliberate, coordinated. But suggestion wasn't proof, and I had nothing that would hold up to scrutiny. The Michaels house was on the other side of town, near the residential edge. Jordan's mother answered, and her account mirrored Lila's. Social pressure, a public argument, withdrawal, then Jordan was gone. Casey Winter's family told the same story. Over the next 2 days, the pattern repeated, each interview reinforcing that these disappearances weren't random, but followed a sequence, as if something in the town had decided these 3 should be erased. Still, the mechanics felt deliberate in a way impossible to prove. People leave towns. People vanish after humiliation. Nothing in the accounts contradicted voluntary departure. Only the insistence of those who loved them that they wouldn't have gone without saying goodbye. I sat in my car outside the last interview, notes on the passenger seat, trying to reconcile what I'd heard with what I could use. The pattern was there. The timing was there. But real, solid proof remained out of reach. The archive smelled of old paper and dust, the sort of scent records acquire as they age. Elise Ramos moved between the shelves with careful steps. Her round glasses caught the light from the high window. Her posture and warm features matched her claim. Meticulous, helpful, the kind of librarian who took the town's history seriously. I'd called ahead that morning to request access to specific records. She'd agreed without hesitation, which should have been my first warning. "I appreciate you making time for this," I said, watching her navigate the narrow aisles between file cabinets and shelving units. "I know it's late in the day." "No problem at all." She adjusted her glasses and turned to face me. "What exactly are you looking for?" I learned by then that directness worked better than dancing around the question. The complete civic registry, missing person files, any activity logs from the Edge crew. Her movements shifted, a slight hesitation before she reached for the nearest cabinet. She opened a drawer and withdrew a ledger and a folder of loose pages, moving less fluidly than before. "These are the civic ledgers," she said, extending them toward me. "Complete as submitted, 15 years of the registry, and the missing person filings for the past decade." I took them to a nearby table and pulled out a chair. She remained standing, watching as I opened the registry first. The pages were dense with names, dates of birth, dates of residency. I flipped through methodically. Patterns emerged almost immediately. "What about the Edge crew logs?" I asked without looking up. "The Edge crew papers are kept separately," she said carefully. "Older records, less tidy than the civic materials." I turned pages. Entries continued through early March. Then the handwriting changed. Not the hand, but the ink was fresher and the pressure different. I traced an entry dated March 15. Beneath the current name, a ghost of another name showed through, written over until the paper thinned. "These pages here," I said, pointing without lifting my eyes from the book. "They've been rewritten." She didn't respond. When I looked up, she was staring at the filing cabinet in the corner, the one she hadn't opened. Her jaw was tight. "The registry is maintained by the town clerk," she said. "Marion submits most updates. I preserve what comes to me." I studied the erasures. The pattern was unmistakable. Some names appeared in January, then vanished by February. Others lasted into early March and were removed in April. The gaps clustered around February, late March, and early April. I knew those months. I'd spent 3 days listening to families describe when loved ones stopped appearing. Devin Hart in late February, Jordan Michaels in early March, Casey Winters in late March. "The dates," I said. "These missing entries correspond to specific time frames." She shifted, hands on the table edge. "I only see what comes across my desk." "But you notice things. You work here. You see what comes through." "I see what I'm shown," she said flatly, "and I file it accordingly." I opened the missing person folder. 3 official forms. 3 names, 3 disappearances. But sparse, minimal detail. No follow-up notes or investigation records. "These are the only missing person reports filed in the past 4 months?" I asked. "Those are the official filings," The word hung between us. I set the folder down and leaned back, studying her. Her glasses had slid down her nose. She didn't push them up. Elise, I need to ask you something directly. Are there other records? Records that aren't in these files? She looked away, fingers gripping the table edge. I'm sorry, I'm not at liberty to say. Can't or won't? I'm afraid both, she said, meeting my eyes. Her expression was apologetic and resigned. Some matters around here are handled differently. I wish I could tell you more. I waited. She didn't continue. The filing cabinet, I said, pointing to the one she'd been avoiding. What's in there? Mostly older municipal files and transfer boxes, she said. Can I see them? No. Her reply was quick, then softer. I'm not authorized to open that cabinet for anyone outside the town board. I closed the registry and stacked the papers, buying time. The gaps were deliberate. Rewritten names, missing filings, the cabinet she refused to open. Everything pointed to something systematic the town wanted erased. Someone told you not to show me these records, I said. Her shoulders dropped. She looked suddenly tired, the pretense of helpfulness worn thin. I've already shown you more than I should have. Please don't ask me for anything else. The silence after her refusal hung between us like something solid. I gathered my notes and stood. The chair scraped the linoleum, loud in the archive. Elise stayed by the cabinet, arms wrapped around herself as if she'd said more than she could afford. I left the library as the light thinned, the kind that meant evening was coming early. The streets of Black Hollow felt different now. Less a town, more a stage where everyone had memorized their lines. I'd spent 3 days talking to families, hearing stories that followed the same shape. Social pressure, then silence, then absence. The pattern was too clean to be accidental. By morning, I'd decided I needed Hank's version directly, not Marion's official story from Town Hall, but whatever he was actually protecting. The sheriff's office sat on Elm in a low brick building that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s. Fluorescent lights hummed, making the space feel smaller. The office was austere, suggesting Hank avoided paperwork. A desk with a few folders, dented filing cabinets, a feed store calendar on the wall. Nothing personal. No sign anyone worked here with real investment. Hank was waiting, as if he'd expected me. Heavy-set, weathered, late 50s, with a posture shaped by years and uncomfortable chairs. He gestured to the chair across from his desk without standing. "Miss Sullivan," he said, "figured you'd show." I sat and pulled out my notebook without opening it. I've been talking to the families of the missing persons. I'd like to hear your department's perspective on the searches. He leaned back. The chair creaked. He took his time answering, pausing as if calculating which version of the truth would hold up. "We ran the searches by the book," he said finally, voice low and gravelly. "Did what the protocol calls for." "Standard procedures that resulted in limited searches," I said. "According to the families, the efforts were minimal." "There wasn't any sign of foul play," he said, factual. "No reason to think they were in danger. When somebody leaves on their own, we don't go tearing the town apart. We file the report, keep an eye out, and let things play out." The phrase, "no reason to think they were in danger," was technically accurate, but beneath the construction was something else. He wasn't protecting evidence so much as a process, a system that decided the answers before the questions were asked. Devin Hart was removed from the Spring Festival Committee, passed over for a work contract, publicly confronted by a Beckett family foreman. 3 days later, Devin stopped appearing at community events. 2 weeks after that, Devin was gone. Hank's expression didn't change. "Folks leave after humiliation," he said. "They pack up and head somewhere else. Happens all the time." Not without saying goodbye, not according to Devin's sister. "Families don't always know what's on a person's mind," he said. He shifted, the first real sign of discomfort, tightness around his eyes. Sometimes people need to vanish to figure themselves out. I leaned forward. 3 people disappeared in 4 months. 2 bodies were recovered from the forest. Your department conducted minimal searches assuming they voluntarily left. That's not protocol, Sheriff. That's a choice. His jaw tightened. He looked toward the window where the morning light was fading. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter but firm. "I'm doing my job," he said. "I follow the rules I'm handed. If you think there's wrongdoing in procedure, take it up with the state police." "I'm not here to file complaints. I'm here to understand what happened to 3 people. Right now, it looks like your department decided they weren't worth finding." He stood, conversation over, at least by his body language. Before I could gather my notes, he spoke again. "Don't poke at this town too hard, Ms. Sullivan," he said, gravelly and steady. "People here have reasons for the way things are. Stir the wrong pot, and you'll set things walking you won't like." I stood, met his eyes. "Then help me understand them." He didn't answer. He walked to the door and opened it. As I passed him, I caught coffee and something like exhaustion, the kind that comes from carrying a weight you can't put down. Outside, the morning air was cold and sharp. I stood on the sidewalk a moment, letting the chill clear my head. Hank's warning had been delivered with precise economy. He'd been taught to say things without saying them. He was following guidelines that protected something very like a system designed to make people disappear. The cold air settled my thoughts, though not how I'd hoped. Hank's words stayed with me as I walked back toward Main Street, each step deliberate, each breath sharp. A system designed to make people disappear. That wasn't speculation anymore. That was what I was looking at. I spent the next 2 days moving through Black Hollow in an almost methodical pattern. Porch to porch, cafe to cafe, sidewalk conversations that started casual and ended nowhere. I talked to people who'd known Devon Hart, worked with Jordan Michaels, or seen Casey Winters around town. The interviews blurred, the same careful phrases, measured responses, and an underlying current I couldn't name. Tom Brennan sat on his porch with a cup of coffee that had probably gone cold. He'd worked construction with Devon. When I asked what happened in the weeks before Devon disappeared, he looked out at his yard like the answer might be written in the grass. "Devon ran afoul of the wrong folks," he said finally. "Round here, that sort of thing doesn't blow up. It withers you out. You ask too many questions, you don't play along, people start to look the other way." "What things?" "The way this town keeps itself neat." He didn't look at me. "You poke at it, you unsettle the pattern. Folks notice. Then they remind themselves why the pattern exists." I pressed. "Did anyone threaten Devon?" "Not with threats you can point to. It's quieter than that." He turned the cup. "Jobs stop. Invites stop. People stop answering you. Slow and steady. After a while, you either bend or you go." At the cafe on Ash and 3rd, Patricia, who ran the register, told me something similar. She'd known Casey Winters since high school. "Casey always lived at the edge," she said as she wiped the counter. "Not mean. Just didn't fit the picture. This town notices that. It chews on it." "Corrects how?" "By making you small. By making it clear there's a price for not fitting." I sat with that. "And if someone won't pay that cost?" She shrugged. "Then they leave. Or they stop being the person everyone remembers." Conversations kept coming. A man at the Civic Center who'd served on the town board. A woman from the Michaels Church. A teenager who'd been in school with all 3. The details varied, but the shape of the story remained consistent. Social pressure applied with precision, conformity enforced through exclusion, and then absence. By the 2nd day, I was starting to doubt myself in a way that felt almost physical. I'd built my career investigating organized crime and corruption, systems where power moved through money, threats, documented orders. I understood those structures. I could read them. This was different. Conformity woven so deeply into the social fabric that questioning it felt like questioning the town. I began to wonder if I was mistaking village cohesion for conspiracy. projecting patterns onto ordinary small-town dynamics because I expected them. I'd come back to thinking my roots would help. I thought growing up here would give me immunity to local mythology, let me see through the town's narrative. Instead, I realized how deep roots run, how loyalty can override judgment so completely people don't recognize it, how a unified story, once widely accepted, becomes impossible to contradict without implying complicity. Maybe they were. It kept me awake in my rental car at the motel, staring at notes I couldn't read. Maybe the town wasn't hiding a conspiracy. Maybe the town was the conspiracy, and everyone, from Tom Brennan to Patricia to those I hadn't talked to, participated simply by accepting the same version of events. I didn't know how to investigate or prove it. The fourth day of interviews began before dawn. I spent the night running through the gaps Elise had shown me, the erasures in the civic registry, the missing pages in the Edge Crew logs. I couldn't sleep. By the time gray light filtered through the motel curtains, I'd showered, dressed, and mapped the northern boundary of Black Hollow Forest on the town's recreation map. Rowan Pierce's name appeared twice in the volunteer records, trailkeeper and maintenance worker for the marked footpaths. If anyone knew the forest's real geography, if anyone had seen something the official narrative couldn't accommodate, it would be someone who worked the boundary. The trailhead kiosk sat at the forest's northern edge, about 3 miles from town. I drove past the last houses and the edge walls' carved posts to a nearly empty parking area. A maintenance truck sat by the kiosk, bed loaded with tools and rope. Rowan Pierce stood beside it, checking something on a clipboard. He was in his early 30s, weathered from outdoor work rather than gym time, the kind of worn that came from sun and labor. His flannel sleeves were rolled up despite the chill. His hands were calloused and competent. I approached, my notebook visible. Rowan Pierce? He looked up from the clipboard, and something in his face shifted immediately. Recognition, maybe, or wariness. Yeah, you're the investigator from the city. Mara Sullivan. I've been talking to people in town about the missing residents. I'd like to ask you a few questions if you have time. He set the clipboard on the truck bed with deliberate care. He didn't invite me closer, but he didn't walk away either. I already talked to Hank about it. I know, but I'm looking at things from a different angle. You work the forest boundary. You'd notice things other people might miss. His jaw tightened. What kind of things? He turned back to the truck, moving tools around with purpose, shoulders tense. Didn't see anything out there, he said finally. But you knew Jordan. He stopped moving, his hands stilled on a coil of rope. Knew him a little. Casual. We'd run into each other on the trail sometimes. Did you warn him about something? The question hung between us. He didn't answer immediately. He picked up the rope, set it down again. When he finally spoke, his voice dropped. There was pressure. Social stuff. People closing ranks. What kind of pressure? The kind where folks stop inviting you, stop talking to you, stop hiring you for jobs. His eyes met mine briefly, then looked away. It happens in small towns. People decide someone doesn't fit, and they make that clear. And you warned him about it? I told him to keep his head down. Don't make waves. Let it blow over. His voice carried something that sounded like regret. That's how these things work. You ride it out. But he didn't wait it out. No, he didn't. I waited, letting the silence work. He shifted his weight, glanced toward the forest, then back at me. His discomfort was different from the careful evasion I'd gotten from Hank or Elise. Rawer, as if he was deciding whether to say more. When Hank's office asked me about Jordan, where he went and when, I didn't tell them everything, Rowan said quietly. I held back a lot. Meeting times, favorite spots. I was trying to give him some privacy. He was being watched enough already. But you're telling me now, because you're asking different questions. He rubbed his face with one hand. And because I think something happened that wasn't voluntary. What do you mean? Jordan left a note. It was short, vague, but the way it read... He paused, searching for words. It didn't read like someone choosing to leave. It read like someone bolting, like running. Do you still have the note? No, I handed it to Hank weeks ago. He said he'd log it. Said it'd help the search. What did it say exactly? He closed his eyes for a moment. Something like, "I can't stay here anymore, I'm sorry." That's the gist. But the handwriting was shaky, and "I can't stay," that isn't "don't want to." "Can't" implies someone took the option away. I understood the distinction instantly. Voluntary departure meant choice. Escape meant the only available option was to leave. Pressure or threat had become real. Where did he leave the note? At my place. He knew I'd find it. He knew I'd understand what it meant. "And you gave it to Hank?" "I did. I shouldn't have, but I did. He said it was evidence. He said it would help the search." A bitter edge entered his voice. "Instead, it got lost in whatever filing system Hank uses for things he wants to forget." The forest behind him was dark. Early spring growth hadn't filled in. I thought about Jordan, about the pressure Rowan had described, about the note that read like escape rather than choice. "Thank you for telling me," I said. "If something happened to him, if he didn't just leave," Rowan nodded slowly. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The silence that followed held its own weight. Rowan didn't move, and neither did I, standing at the edge of something neither of us wanted to name. The forest stretched behind him, thin with early spring, and I thought about what he'd said. The note, Hank, the difference between leaving and running. It was the distinction that mattered in my work, the difference between a cold case and a closed one. I drove back into town as the afternoon light shifted, making everything look slightly unreal. My rental car felt too clean, too new for these roads. The library on Maple Street had probably been expanded twice since its original construction. I'd been there on day 3 when Elise showed me the official records and I noticed the gaps. This time I was going back with a question I should have asked then. Elise was alone in the back office, adjacent to the archives cabinet. She looked up from a cataloging form. Something in her face shifted. Not fear, exactly, but recognition of something she'd been waiting for. "I need to ask you something," I said, keeping my voice level, like in interviews when I didn't want to sound judgmental. "Are there records that aren't in the official files?" Her hands stilled. She set down her pen with deliberate care, and I watched her breathe as if it cost her. "Yes," she whispered. She stood and moved to the filing cabinet, the one she'd avoided on my first visit. Her hands trembled as she reached for it, and I realized what I should have days ago. She hadn't been protecting the records. She'd been waiting for someone to ask, for permission to stop carrying them alone. The ledger was unremarkable except for the precise handwriting inside. Every page was filled with her careful script, dated, detailed. I read the first few lines and felt the room change. Request. Town Hall Records, Civic Registry, March 2022. Requester, Marion Keyes, Town Hall Clerk. Changes made. 3 names removed from Civic roster. Reason given, administrative error. Request, Edge Crew Activity Logs, April 2022. Requester, Hank Calder. Changes made, 2 weeks of entries deleted, replaced with revised summary. Reason given, clerical consolidation. The names kept appearing: Marion, Hank, Pastor Jonah Keene, members of the town council, and repeatedly, representatives from the Beckett and Hawthorne families, people I hadn't interviewed, named on requests unrelated to their official roles. "How long have you been keeping this?" I asked. "From my first day," Elise said softly. 3 years. When I saw it, I couldn't simply look the other way." She stood with her arms wrapped around herself, staring at the ledger as if it might burn her. "Why didn't you show this to Hank? To anyone?" "Because Hank knows," she said, voice thin. "He's on these pages. He asked for some of the changes himself." She put her hand to her mouth for a moment, as if to steady the shape of the words. "They all know I know. They've made it plain that what I do with this ledger matters." She swallowed. "I kept it as insurance. If I vanished, if I ended up like the others, there'd at least be a trace. At least someone would understand why." The fear was real. This wasn't a woman protecting a secret so much as terrified of what it meant. of what would happen whether she kept it or let it go. "You won't disappear. Not on my watch," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it, and she didn't either. Whispers at the forest's edge. The drive back to the Black Hollow Inn took 15 minutes. I watched the forest edge blur past the windows. The ledger was in my jacket pocket, wrapped in the cloth Elise provided. Its weight felt disproportionate. By the time I pulled into the inn parking lot, darkness had settled over town. The neon sign above the entrance flickered, an outline of a hollow tree, and cast everything in a sickly glow. My room was on the second floor, corner unit at Main and Cedar. I'd chosen it for the window that overlooked both streets and the alley. Privacy wasn't guaranteed in a place like this, but sightlines mattered. I locked the door and pulled the curtains. The room was small. Bed, desk, dresser, a bathroom the size of a closet. But mine for the week, paid in cash, registered under a name that wasn't entirely false. I set the ledger on the desk and switched on the lamp. The bulb was weak, but enough. The ledger was leather-bound. Its pages were yellowed. Elise's handwriting was precise, almost architectural. I opened to the first entry and read. The structure emerged quickly. Dates ran chronologically, beginning 3 years back. Names followed, residents of Black Hollow, though not all of them. Beside each name were notations, requests made, records altered, pages removed from official files. The pattern was meticulous. Someone requested a change. Elise recorded who asked and what was removed or altered. Edge sessions, underlined, appeared repeatedly. I flipped pages as the pattern solidified. They weren't random tidying, but coordinated removals, each preceded by a nomination process Elise abbreviated ES. The Board of Founding Families, she'd written, closed proceedings. No record kept except what I maintain. I photographed each page with my phone, working methodically from front to back. My hands stayed steady as the implications accumulated. This wasn't speculation or inference. This was documentation. Elise had recorded the mechanics of exclusion as they happened, naming initiators and tracking consequences. 3 names appeared repeatedly: Beckett, Hawthorne, and Keene, the pastor's family. Their names clustered around entries where sections of the civic registry had been rewritten. Beside each, Elise added initials or descriptors: J.K. for Jonah Keene, H.B. for someone in the Becketts, and an H that, from context, likely meant Hank. The consequences section made the pattern undeniable. After each edge session, the ledger tracked removals from civic committees, canceled contracts, restricted access at employers. One entry from 2 years back, Thomas Vale, traced his systematic exclusion from every functional role. Within 6 months, he had left Black Hollow. I kept photographing. The mechanics were informal, no written orders, no decrees, so they wouldn't survive legal scrutiny, but the coordination was unmistakable. Someone nominated a resident. The board convened in edge sessions. Marion implemented the decisions by altering records and coordinating with employers. The targeted resident was gradually isolated until leaving became the only option. Except Devin Hart hadn't left. Neither had Jordan Michaels or Casey Winters. I set the phone down and stared. Entries for the 3, Devin, Jordan, Casey, dated within the past 4 months, each preceded by an edge session and followed by the same sequence of exclusions. But unlike the others, there were no departure records. There were no departure records, no indication they'd left, just absence. The ledger showed what came after nomination. It didn't show what happened when the nominated resident refused to leave. I closed the book and leaned back. The room was quiet except for traffic on Main and the building's occasional creak. I thought of Elise's trembling hands as she handed me the ledger. Her words, "They all know I keep records." And the fear when she said she'd kept the record as insurance, a trace in case she disappeared. The town had a system. Efficient, coordinated, practiced until invisible. Marion delivered the official narrative. Hank enforced boundaries. The board made decisions, and Elise, terrified and meticulous, documented every step. I checked the photos. They'd come through clearly and were backed up to encrypted cloud storage accessible to only me. If something happened to the ledger, the evidence would still exist. I set the phone on the desk and sat in the dark for a while, listening to the town settle into night around me. The morning light filtered through the library windows in pale bands, and I found Elise already at the reading table by the back stacks, her hands wrapped around a mug she wasn't drinking. The coffee had probably gone cold hours ago. She looked like she hadn't slept. I sat across from her, opened the ledger to the first marked page. "These entries," I said, keeping my voice low, "they're not random removals. They're not random removals." Her fingers tightened around the mug. I ran through what I'd found. The dates, the names, the pattern of items disappearing across Black Hollow. A watch from the Hendersons, a photograph from the Coles mantel, a rope from near the edge of town. Clothing, shoes, things belonging to people who'd been nominated. She flinched, went rigid for a moment, then looked away. "You knew about this," I said. It wasn't a question. "I knew people were losing things," she said quietly. "At first, it seemed incidental. But once I traced the older records together, a pattern formed." She set the mug down. "The town calls it offering duties. The Edge Crew, that's what they call themselves, do welfare checks at the boundary, maintenance work. That's the official reason they go to people's homes." "But they're taking things." "Yes." She looked at me, her eyes hollow. "The town believes these are offerings, an acknowledgement of something at the forest's edge. It's an old practice. Stewardship, boundary maintenance. It slipped into habit so slowly no one questions it anymore." I turned the page. The entries grew specific. Items weren't merely taken, they were cataloged. Descriptions, dates, names of those who'd surrendered them. "Surrendered" appeared in a margin note, underlined twice. She leaned forward. "I didn't ask why the items were arranged until I realized the arrangement pointed to a place, a specific spot." "Where?" "Deeper in the forest. It's a clearing. I found references to it in older civic minutes, mentions of stewardship, boundary acknowledgement, ritual maintenance. But no one speaks of it outright. It lives in the margins of everything the town does, acknowledged but never discussed." I looked up. "Have you been there?" "No." She shook her head. "I haven't. I only read about it. The records mention symbols carved into nearby trees that mark the place. It's been there a long time, Mara. Longer than any of the current board members have been alive." The library was quiet. Outside, an early spring wind moved through the trees. I heard it against the building's frame. Her hands had stopped shaking, but her jaw remained clenched. "The items in this ledger, the watch, the photograph, the rope, the clothing, belonged to the people who disappeared, didn't they?" She didn't answer at once. When she spoke, she whispered, "Some of them. Not all. But some." The library air felt thin after that. Elise's whisper hung between us like something that couldn't be taken back, and I understood then why she'd been so careful with the ledger, why her hands had shaken when she showed it to me. The items weren't random. They were deliberate. They were evidence of a system so practiced, it had become invisible to the people operating it. I closed the ledger, though the damage was already done. The knowledge was in me now, spreading like a thing I couldn't contain. "I need to see it," I said. Elise's eyes widened. "The clearing?" "Yes." "Mara, no." She stopped, jaw working. "That place isn't safe. Not for you, not for anyone who pokes where they shouldn't." She folded the words into a softer cadence, then reached for a sheet of paper. "Folks say curiosity lights the way until the smoke hides the path." She murmured almost to herself and began to draw. She pulled a sheet of paper and drew a map with quick, efficient strokes. Her hands steadied now she had something concrete to do. She marked the trail that led east from the main path, traced the switchbacks and unmarked junctions, and added notations for landmarks I'd recognize. When she finished, she slid it across the table toward me. "Rowan knows these woods better than anyone," she said. "If you're going to do this, ask him. He'll give you better directions than I can." I found Rowan at the forest's edge, where maintained trails ended. Exactly where Elise said he'd be. He was checking rope strung between two saplings, his movements methodical. He didn't look surprised. He looked resigned. "Elise sent you," he said. "I need directions to the clearing on the eastern slope." He finished tying off the rope. His fingers were calloused from years of this work. "Not a spot for weekend wanderers," he said. "I'm not a casual visitor." He turned to face me, something shifting in his expression. A decision. He pulled a hand-drawn map from his pocket and traced the route with a finger. The path went deeper than casual hikers ventured, through unmaintained sections where undergrowth thickened and markers were sparse. His reluctance showed in every gesture. He moved slowly through the directions, as if pace could stop me. "The switchback's here," he said, pointing, "and here. Don't take the left fork at the third junction. That leads to the old quarry. Take the right, the one that looks less traveled." "How long?" 40, if you keep a good pace. Longer if you pick your steps." I would be careful. He folded the map and handed it over. His eyes met mine. I saw guilt mixed with something else. Maybe recognition he couldn't stop me, or the weight of knowing what I'd find. The forest swallowed me when I left the main trail. The air changed, heavier, layered with decay and new growth. My jacket snagged on low branches. I freed it and kept moving, following Rowan's map, counting junctions, taking the right fork where the trail nearly disappeared. The clearing opened suddenly, as if the forest had been holding its breath and finally exhaled. It was nearly circular, ringed by saplings and old growth. The ground was bare, swept or worn clean, use or intention. Symbols were carved into the bark. At first they were just marks, then resolved into familiar forms, geometric patterns, simple shapes and sequence. I'd seen them before in a children's game manual years ago. Someone had repurposed those patterns here, where they meant something else. The center of the clearing held the real purpose of this place. Objects lay arranged with meticulous care. A tarnished watch with a broken face, hands frozen. A photograph curled at the edges. The image faded but clear enough. I picked it up and the face resolved. The jaw, the eyes, Devon Hart, arranged like an offering, like evidence no one was supposed to find. Beside it, rope coiled in precise loops. Rope that could be used for many purposes, none good here. Next to that, a small carved box, empty. Someone had collected them. It was too careful to be random. No initials, no ledger tags, no signatures. The absence of names made it feel personal and anonymous, as if someone wanted memory without attribution. I stood in the center and tried to fit the pieces together. Not a shrine, not spiritual. It read like testimony, a record kept where no ledger could be opened. It suggested a pattern. People pushed out, made to leave in unspoken ways, their traces collected and preserved. It seemed systematic, but the evidence was circumstantial. If this was a record, who was it for, and who decided what counted? The clarity of its purpose struck me. This wasn't random cruelty. It was deliberate. Someone keeping score. But of whom and for what remained a question in the ringed trees. The walk back through the forest took longer than the walk in. My legs felt heavier, my mind occupied with what I'd seen in the clearing. By the time I reached the tree line and found the path back to town, the sun had fallen and shadows stretched across the forest floor. I didn't hurry. There was no point. The clearing had given me pieces, but pieces weren't proof. Not yet. I made it back to Black Hollow Inn as afternoon collapsed into evening. The lobby was empty except for the desk clerk, who didn't look up. My room was exactly as I'd left it, the window over Main Street, Elise's ledger on the desk, my notes scrawled in the margins of a legal pad. I sat and didn't move for a long time. I worked through the ledger again, this time with the clearing in mind. The entries Elise had documented, the names, the dates, the notations of what had been removed from civic records, weren't random administrative mistakes. They were deliberate deletions. Someone had requested and authorized them. Elise, in the library with her cold mug, had recorded what was being erased. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the photos I'd taken from each page. The pattern was there if you looked. Edge sessions, formal nominations, names recurring in the margins. Beckett, Hawthorne, Keene. Then the aftermath in Elise's handwriting, removal from the civic roster, canceled employment contracts, access denied at local businesses. The system didn't require a single architect. That clarity built as the dark gathered. Each piece could be explained away. Edge sessions as board meetings, employment cancellations as business decisions, sermon talk of stewardship as pastoral guidance. The wall the Edge crew maintained without question, the clearing they kept accessible without understanding why, the sheriff's delayed searches and technically accurate reports that never quite found anything. Each could stand alone as coincidence, but together they formed something else. I thought about the objects in the clearing, the watch with the broken face, the photograph of Devon, the rope, the box that held nothing. Someone had collected and arranged them with meticulous care. They had decided the town would keep its record here, not in an official ledger that could be subpoenaed, but in a hidden shrine where no one was supposed to look. My phone buzzed, a text from Lila. "Hey, hun, any news?" I stared for a long moment, then replied, "I'm on it. I'll call tomorrow." I returned to the ledger. Entries from 3 years ago revealed a pattern I hadn't grasped until now. Nominations came in clusters, 3 people in one session, 2 in the next, then a gap, then 4 more. Each cluster was followed by systematic removals from the civic records, employment terminated, presence gradually erased from official documentation. Then the gaps, months with no entries, when nothing was deleted, nothing nominated. The machinery wasn't broken, it was waiting. I stood at the window. Main Street was quiet, cars parked, streetlights coming on. From here, the town looked ordinary, the kind of place where nothing terrible happened, and people didn't ask about what they weren't supposed to see. The clarity crystallized. This wasn't a conspiracy in the usual sense. There was no single decision to expel people. It had happened gradually, refined into something smooth and invisible, soft violence that left no bruises, explained away with euphemisms and procedures, distributing responsibility so widely no individual could be held accountable. Edge sessions left no formal record. Ballots were destroyed. Arrangements with employers were phone calls. No documentation, no signatures, no chain of instruction. Pastor Jonah's sermons obliquely spoke of stewardship and community care, normalizing withdrawal. The Edge crew maintained the wall and clearing without understanding why. The sheriff delayed searches and filed technically accurate reports that never located anything. No single actor could be named the architect. The architecture was distributed across so many hands, it resembled consensus. The town had built machinery of soft violence and collectively believed in its necessity. I sat and pulled the ledger closer. This was managed expulsion, a town-scale process refined until almost invisible. It didn't require force or threats, only that everyone understood their role and played it without asking. The question now was what I was going to do with that understanding. The question now was what I was going to do with that understanding. A week passed before I went to the garage lot where the Edge crew staged their equipment. 7 days of sitting with what the ledger and the clearing had showed me. 7 days of watching the town move through its routines as though nothing was wrong. I'd spent the morning reviewing notes, cross-referencing names, mapping who knew what and who was responsible for which machinery. By the time I drove to the maintenance yard, the sun was high enough to cast sharp shadows between the trucks. The crew was in the middle of a shift change when I arrived. 6 men, maybe 7, moving between equipment and vehicles with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this work for years. Mostly mechanics with weathered hands and grease stains. A couple moved like men with farming backgrounds, equally familiar with engines and soil. Men who didn't ask unnecessary questions. Authority had never needed to explain itself to them. I waited until most had dispersed to their tasks, then approached the heavyset man I'd identified as the foreman. Garrett Holcomb, in his late 40s, had run the wall and trail maintenance schedules from the town garage for years. A former farm mechanic with council-approved contracts to fund his crew, he was known for tight-lipped compliance and for passing instructions without commentary. He was under a truck when he noticed me. His body shifted, shoulders tightened, and he straightened up slower than necessary. "Morning," I said. "You're Garrett?" He nodded, wiping his hands on a rag so dirty it likely made things worse. "That's right. You're the woman staying at the inn." It wasn't a question. Small towns don't require questions to know who you are. "I wanted to ask you about some of the work the crew does," I said, "specifically the trail maintenance and marker placements." His jaw tightened. When he spoke, he chose his words carefully. "Trail work's routine," he said. "We keep markers put up, cut back brush, keep the paths passable. Same old, same old." "I've heard that the crew sometimes redirects the markers," I said. "Changes where they point." Garrett went still. Someone called about a hydraulic line. He held up a hand without looking away. The silence stretched long enough for the garage sounds to fill it. Metal on metal, a truck turning over, a distant radio. "Who told you that?" he asked finally. "Does it matter?" He pushed out a breath. "Look, I'm not saying we don't move things. We do what we're told. Town pays us. Town tells us what to fix. Every job's got a name on it and a stamp. If somebody wants a trail nudged, we nudge it." Directed by who? Discomfort shifted into resignation. He leaned against the truck, crossing his arms. "There's an old family in town, been here since the start. Folks call him the keeper. Quiet like. They don't go about it themselves. They pass word through Hank or through council folks. Say which trails, when, what the markers should say. We follow the orders." "Why?" I asked. "Because it's easier to keep your head down," Garrett said, voice flat with a thread of anger. "Because the contracts and the money come from the council. Say no and you'll lose more than pride. You know how things run here." I understood exactly how it worked. I'd been watching it operate since I arrived. "Who is the keeper? What's their actual name?" Garrett's jaw clenched. He looked toward the tree line, toward the forest where the trails wound deeper than most ventured. "I can't give you a name," he said, "not without putting people on the spot, and that ain't something I do." It didn't. What mattered was that the crew, however unspoken, knew their work at the forest edge served purposes beyond maintenance. The markers weren't guiding hikers. The clearing wasn't a scenic overlook. The objects they collected from people's homes and arranged in that hidden space weren't welfare checks. They were offerings, and the crew knew it even if they never said so. Garrett pushed off the truck. "Anything else?" "Not right now," I said. He nodded and returned to work. I watched the crew for a moment. They didn't look at me or acknowledge me. They continued following instructions passed down through channels that distributed responsibility so thoroughly no single person could be held accountable. I turned and walked back to my car, my mind already on the next name on my list. The next person who might be willing to tell me what they knew. The garage lot fell behind me as I drove back through town, my hands steady on the wheel while my mind raced. Garrett's reluctance had confirmed what the ledger and the clearing had suggested. The machinery ran on distributed orders. People following instructions passed through channels that obscured their origin. No one wanted to name the keeper. No one wanted to admit they understood what they were doing. I needed to talk to Hank directly. Not with questions this time, but with what I'd reconstructed laid out in front of him like evidence at a trial. The sheriff's office sat on Elm Street, a brick building older than most of the town, with a parking lot and a front entrance opening into a waiting area. I'd been here before, but only briefly. This time I walked past a dispatcher's desk without stopping and knocked on the door marked Private Office. He sat at his desk with papers spread in front of him. He looked up. His expression shifted from neutral to guarded. "Mara," he said, still seated. "Not sure there's anything left for us to talk about." "We do." I closed the door and pulled the chair across from him. "I've been talking to people. The garage crew. I've seen the ledger. I've been to the clearing." His jaw tightened. He set down his pen. "I know about the Edge sessions," I continued. "I know about the nominations. I know about the arrangements with employers, the delayed searches, the missing persons reports filed as voluntary departures. I know the board approached you 20 years ago with an informal arrangement. Your cooperation in exchange for protection and funding. I know you've been operating within that bargain ever since." I laid out the ledger pages I'd photographed across his desk. Dates, names, procedural notations of decisions made in closed sessions. He didn't look at them. He stared at me as resignation settled on his face. "You've been busy," he said. He was silent a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different, not defensive or calculated, but weary. 20 years back, he said, something happened. I'm not going to say what. It rattled the town. The board came to me with a choice, and they weren't subtle about it. They told me the other choice was to let the town fall apart in public. They promised me protection. They promised funding. They said, cooperate, keep things steady, and I could stay sheriff. He leaned back, his weathered face lined by the afternoon light. I took them at their word, he continued. I figured a town in pieces would be worse than one managed from behind a curtain. I convinced myself my cooperation kept worse from happening, so I've worked within that bargain for 20 years. By delaying searches, I said. By holding off on searches when they told me to. By writing reports with wording that kept things neat. By taking briefings from the board about who was marked for exclusion, and by making sure my office didn't poke where it would blow everything open. He paused, hands flat on the desk. I became the town's tool for carrying out those decisions. My badge made it stick, he said. I lent official weight to what was, in practice, organized expulsion. I knew what I was doing. The shame was real, evident in his shoulders and the way he wouldn't meet my eyes. But it didn't change what he'd done. The people who'd disappeared, the families left without answers. The system operating between official denial and unspoken understanding. Why are you telling me this? I asked. He was quiet a long time. Because you already know, he said finally, voice low. And I'm tired, Mara. Damn tired. The silence that followed his admission hung between us like something physical. I heard the hum of fluorescent lights and someone moving in the bullpen beyond his office door. Hank sat with his palms on the desk, as if he needed the surface to keep him anchored. I left the sheriff's office without another word. Anything else would only complicate what I had to do. Light was failing by the time I reached the forest edge. I'd driven north from town, past the last houses and the turnoff locals avoided. The parking pull-off at the north gate of Black Hollow Forest was empty. Gravel and a weathered sign marking the trailhead. I stood at the tree line, watching the sky darken. The clarity I'd been building toward crystallized, sharp, unavoidable. The system was fully visible to me now, not as a theory or suspicion, but as architecture. The board's closed edge sessions where names were nominated for removal. Marion's recording mechanism, the ledger entries and formal documentation that gave the appearance of procedure. Employers canceling contracts on cue. Pastor Jonah's sermons framing withdrawal as community care. Hank's delayed searches and manipulated reports that turned social decisions into law. Dr. Adler's ambiguous autopsies that raised no questions. The Edge crew's redirected trails and maintained clearing. The physical infrastructure for an invisible process. The keeper orchestrating from behind layers of intermediaries and silence. Each had plausible deniability. Each could claim they were just doing their job. Together, though, they formed something coordinated and deliberate. The missing, Devin, Jordan, and now Casey, still in town and marked, had been isolated by machinery designed to feel inevitable. They'd been given a choice: stay and endure escalating exclusion, or leave. The town called it voluntary departure, a poisoned term chosen with enough coordination and diffusion of responsibility that defending it required only maintained silence. I understood I'd reached a decision point. I could try negotiation, get Hank to document his arrangement, pressure Elise to make the ledger official, push for quiet reform. I could work within the system and minimize the damage. Or I could accept that some truths couldn't remain buried without corrupting everything they supported. That justice sometimes requires exposure even if it brings collapse. The decision took less time than I expected. I drove back to the Black Hollow Inn as darkness settled over Main Street. My rental room was on the second floor, a corner with a desk by the window. I sat with my phone and laptop and contacted the Vermont State Police first. The officer who answered was professional, cautious. I told her I had evidence of systematic exclusion in a small town. People had disappeared, linked to coordinated institutional action. She asked for specifics. I gave names, dates, and the pattern of edge sessions tied to subsequent removals. I then called the state attorney general's office. I walked them through what I'd found. Elise's shadow ledger documenting record deletions and exclusion procedures, my documentation of the clearing, my reconstruction of the Edge crew's trail modifications, a chronology of exclusions tied to Edge session dates. I provided names: board members Beckett and Hawthorne, Hank Calder, Marion Keyes, Dr. Naomi Adler, Pastor Jonah Keene, the keeper, whose identity I'd confirmed via the ledger and founding family genealogies, Garrett Holcomb, and the Edge crew. Each had participated. I told them about Casey, still in town, still marked, vulnerable to the same machinery. The state authorities responded within 48 hours. Shadowed markers. The state police arrived on a Tuesday morning, 2 unmarked sedans pulling into Black Hollow just after 9. I watched from the diner window as they parked near Town Hall, their movements deliberate and unhurried. They'd done this before. Knew small towns required patience, letting exposure unfold so panic wouldn't make things worse. I'd spent the last 48 hours in my room at the inn, moving between the desk and the window, waiting for the phone. It rang twice. First, Reeves, a state investigator, confirming receipt of my materials and asking about dates and locations. Second, Elise, voice tight, saying Marion Keyes had visited, asking, with careful phrasing that was a threat, whether she'd shared her research outside the library. Elise said no. Marion smiled and left. Elise called me then, and I realized the machinery was already shifting. Watching them, I felt the weight of what I'd set in motion. No negotiation left, no quiet reform, no board conversation that would leave Casey alone. Only the machinery turning the other way, grinding against itself. I went to the diner and ordered coffee I didn't want. It was fuller than usual. People fell quiet when I entered, then resumed in low tones after I sat in the corner. News spreads fast in towns like this. By noon, everyone would know the state investigators were here. By evening, they'd know why. At 10:30, Hank came in, uniform pressed, expression neutral. He ordered coffee, then, after a hesitation, walked to my table. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. I gestured. He sat, hands around his mug, jaw working as if choosing safe words. "They're here about the ledger," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "About all of it?" "Yes." He drank. The diner was quiet enough to hear the grill and clatter. Hank kept his voice low. "I told you things I shouldn't have," he said. "Thought I was confessing. Didn't know you were building a case." "You were confessing. I was building a case. They aren't mutually exclusive." "No, I suppose they're not." He set the mug down. "Casey's already gone. She left yesterday morning. Packed up and drove out before dawn. House was empty when I checked." It landed harder than I expected. I'd assumed Casey was still here and vulnerable. That she'd left meant she'd either acted on her own or been warned. "Who told her?" I asked. "I don't know. Could have been Rowan, someone from the church, or her own instinct." He paused. "She left a note at the sheriff's office saying she'd decided Black Hollow wasn't for her, thanking the town but saying she needed to find somewhere else to build her life." The language was too clean. Someone had helped. But she was gone. She was safe. "They're going to want to talk to you," I said. "I know." He looked at me with exhausted relief. "I rang a lawyer in Burlington, someone who knows municipal corruption. I'll cooperate. I'll hand over the records. Every board request, every directive I followed, every person I delayed. I'll testify about the deal they offered me 20 years ago. I'll tell them everything." "Why?" I asked. "'Cause I'm tired," he shrugged. A little laugh that wasn't funny. 20 years wears a man down. You were right. Some truths rot in a place from the inside out." He picked up his coffee. "And 'cause Casey left a note that wasn't true, I'm done being part of that machine." He finished his coffee and stood. Leaning close, he lowered his voice. "The keeper's Eleanor Hawthorne. She's been pulling strings longer than I've been sheriff. She came to me 20 years back, set out who gets marked, and made sure folks knew the work's purpose. She ain't cruel for the sake of it. She thinks she's protecting the town. That's the dangerous part." He left before I could answer. I watched him walk to town hall, where the investigators waited. My coffee had gone cold. I pushed it aside and sat with what he told me. Eleanor Hawthorne, a name I'd seen in the ledger, in founding family genealogies, in Edge Sessions records for more than a decade. But a name isn't the person. She built a system that ran without her direct involvement, through intermediaries, distributed responsibility, and people's tendency to follow patterns without questioning them. The investigators would find her, build a case, and move through town systematically, collecting statements and pulling the machinery apart. But the real work wouldn't be legal. It would be understanding how the town convinced itself that exclusion was community care, documenting not just what happened, but why people let it happen. And that work, I suspected, was only beginning. The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. Every word and glance left a trace, as if the walls had absorbed the afternoon's weight. I walked away with the impression that something had ended, though I couldn't name it. By late afternoon, I was back at the sheriff's office on Elm Street. The building was quieter than usual, the front desk unmanned, the hallway to Hank's office dimly lit by winter sun slanting through narrow windows. I didn't knock. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. Hank sat at his desk, papers scattered. He looked up, unsurprised, as if he'd expected me. His face was drawn, the lines around his eyes deeper than I remembered days before. I didn't come with questions. I laid out what I'd compiled. Elisa's ledger first, pages marked and organized, photographs of the clearing and its arranged objects, trail map showing redirected routes, the pattern of exclusions spanning years. I placed each piece deliberately, watching his face as the scope of my findings became visible. He listened without interruption. His jaw tightened as I moved through the evidence, but he kept his eyes on me. When I finished, I sat across from him and waited. Resignation settled into his features, like a weight set down after years. He leaned back and, for a long moment, said nothing. His hands rested on the desk, palms down, as if steadying himself. 20 years ago, he said, voice low and gravelly, something happened. I didn't push for details. I'd learned that silence sometimes worked better than questions. It shook the town, he went on. Afterward, the board came to me, quietly. They wanted things handled without making a mess. Said they'd look after the office, keep the town steady. In return, I was to smooth things over when people didn't fit the picture. He looked at his hands. I took it. Didn't see any other way without tearing folks apart. Thought I was doing the right thing. What kind of departures? I asked. People pushed out. Folks who weren't what the town needed them to be. His voice is flat, tired. I held off searches when they told me to. Called some disappearances voluntary when I had my doubts. Took briefings on who was to be eased out and kept my mouth shut if an investigation would blow the story up. He looked up. The exhaustion in his eyes wasn't the wear of a long day, but of 2 decades under the weight of what he'd done. My badge became the tool for it, he said. Decisions that should have been social got turned into law by my office. It made the clean work look official. Who directed you? I asked. He hesitated. I saw the calculation cross his face. The last moment deciding whether to protect someone or let the machinery break apart. Eleanor Hawthorne, he said, the keeper. She's run this longer than I've been sheriff. The board answers to her, even when they think it's their call. The shame in his voice was genuine, but irrelevant. Shame didn't undo what he'd done. It only meant he finally understood the cost. I'm cooperating with the state investigators, he said. I've retained counsel. I'm handing over records, and I intend to testify about the board directives and the arrangement with Eleanor. I nodded. He'd already made that decision before I walked in. This conversation was something else, a confession maybe, or an attempt to make sense of how a man could spend 2 decades building a system of exclusion and call it protection. There's more, he said. Things I haven't told anyone yet. Things that will matter when this goes to trial. I waited. The crew that shifts the trails, they're part of a bigger spool, he said, voice tightening. Elise has been keeping the paperwork tidy, changing records so no one notices. Naomi's reports have been bent to fit the town's line. Pastor Keen's been preaching it as mercy. And some people never even got reported missing. They just vanished from the books. The words hung between us. Outside, the afternoon light was fading. Shadows had lengthened across Hank's office floor. Staying would only delay what came next. I left without another word, moving past filing cabinets and photographs of past sheriffs, past the dispatcher's desk where no one looked up. The evening air hit me, cooler than that morning, carrying the first hint of the season turning. I drove north without deciding to, following the road that curved toward Black Hollow Forest. The pull-off at the north gate was nearly empty. One other vehicle parked far enough away that I couldn't make out its plates. I cut the engine and stepped out, my boots crunching on gravel that still held the day's warmth. The sun was descending, a light taking on that late afternoon quality when everything cast long shadows and the world paused before dark. I stood at the forest edge with my back to the town, watching the tree line blur into silhouette. Everything crystallized then. The board's closed sessions that left no formal record, Elise's deletions and shadow entries, recording decisions made somewhere else, employers canceling work through unwritten calls that left no trace, the pastor's sermons reframing withdrawal as stewardship, the sheriff's delayed investigations, his badge turned into an instrument of expulsion, the medical examiner's language, precise enough to be professional but vague enough to fit the town's narrative, the crew moving trail markers in a hidden clearing, doing the town's work without ever quite understanding whose hand they served. The missing had been isolated by a machinery designed to feel inevitable rather than imposed. No single person had ordered removals. The system had arranged itself so staying became unbearable and leaving looked like freedom. They'd been given a choice: stay and endure escalating humiliation, the canceled work, whispered conversations that stopped when you entered, slow erasure from the town's social fabric, or leave. Voluntary departure was poisoned. But it was the town's term. Responsibility was distributed so widely that defending it required only silence. The board could claim they merely discussed community concerns. Hank could say he was following procedure. Elise could insist she was maintaining records as instructed. The pastor could point to sermons about stewardship. The crew could say they were just doing their jobs. I turned to face the town, its lights beginning to emerge as the sky darkened. The distance between forest and buildings felt like two different worlds, and I stood in between. I could still negotiate, pressure Hank to put the arrangement in writing and make himself valuable enough to protect, convince Elise to formalize the ledger into an official policy, suggest quiet reforms to the board that would look like progress without dismantling anything, work within the system's logic and hope internal pressure produced change. Or I could accept that some truths corrode everything built on them when left buried. The machinery Hank described, the coordination he'd confessed to, decades of systematic exclusion, none of it could be reformed from within. It could only be exposed, and exposure would bring collapse. The town's reputation shattered, families fractured, people I'd spoken to facing legal consequences. The careful balance that had held Black Hollow for 20 years would come undone. I stood as the light continued to fade, hands in my pockets, feeling the weight of a choice that couldn't be unmade once I made it. The forest path turnout lay 200 yards south of the north gate, a clearing where the woods opened enough to let the day's last light filter through. Hank found me there, his heavy frame moving carefully through the darkening trees, branches cracking under his boots. He was breathing hard, not from exertion, but from dread, the weight of what he was about to say. We stood without the formality of his office between us. Out here, in the gathering dark, he was just a man who'd made choices he couldn't unmake. "I know what you're planning," he said. His voice was rough, stripped of its usual official tone. "You're going to expose this, all of it." I said nothing. There was no point in lying. He turned away, looking into the forest. "You understand what that does? What it destroys?" "I understand what it preserves if I don't," I said. Hank was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his words came slowly, as if pulled from deep down. "Protecting this town has exacted a profound cost. I've known that for years. But I couldn't imagine Black Hollow surviving exposure. It would destroy the other decades in the making. It would fracture the families whose cooperation I depended on. The town would turn from a functioning community into a place of accusation and retribution." He swallowed. "I can't keep pretending it's not true. I can't keep hiding." "I thought you couldn't imagine it," I said. "I didn't say I could stop it." He straightened, jaw set. "I've called a lawyer. Tomorrow I'll hand over the call logs, the edge briefings, the board records, everything I have. I'll tell what was said in those meetings. No more hiding." "I'm going to route that to the state," I said. He nodded, relieved. "Do what you must. I know what this will do. I'm ready to accept the consequences." He looked at me for a long moment, then walked back toward the trees, his footsteps fading into the forest. The library's back entrance was quiet when I found Elise there. Evening had shifted toward night. She waited, small frame folded, arms wrapped around herself as if to hold herself together. When she saw me, she began to shake. "I can't," she began and stopped. I waited. Sometimes silence was the only thing that worked. "I've been documenting it," she said finally. "All of it. Every altered entry, every erased name, every fake date. Each was a small betrayal I rationalized as protecting the library, as if the library mattered more than people whose names I erased." Her voice dropped to a whisper. She trembled, hands shaking. "My role was to preserve the town's narrative," she continued. "That's what they told me when I took the job. I did it methodically. Erased names, changed dates, so anyone looking back would see what the town wanted." She looked up, and I could see the weight breaking through her rationalizations. "The weight of that complicity is breaking me." I didn't try to comfort her. Comfort would have been a lie. Rowan was at the trailhead when I found him, standing at the entrance to the path that led deeper into the forest. The light was nearly gone, a faint glow on the horizon. "Casey's marked for exclusion," he said. "I heard it at the diner this morning. They've already started." "What did Casey do?" I asked, though I thought I already knew.
Casey questioned the consensus at the Civic Forum last week. Asked why certain people left town, wanted to know the real reasons. Rowan shook his head. That's all it took.
The machinery was in motion. Subtle removements from social groups, whispered comments, the isolation that precedes departure. By the time Casey realized it, it would be too late. The town would have decided Casey didn't belong. "How long?" I asked.
Weeks, maybe. They wait. They nudge. Gossip. Make life smaller until folks leave thinking it's their choice.
I thought about the word choose, used to describe decisions made under systematic exclusion. How the town had warped it. "I'm going to expose this," I said. Rowan didn't look surprised. He nodded slowly, as if he'd been waiting.
"I know," he said. "I've known since you started asking questions."
The walk back to town felt longer than it should have. The forest released me gradually, trees thinning until the scattered lights of Black Hollow appeared. My phone had been off since the afternoon. I turned it on as I reached the edge of Main Street, and notifications poured in. Missed calls, unread messages, the small digital debris of a day I'd spent moving between people and their confessions. The Black Hollow Inn sat quiet at the corner of Main and Elm. I climbed the narrow stairs to my second-floor room, locked the door, and pulled the chair to the window. The street below was empty. A single streetlight cast everything in amber. I opened my laptop and began to work. The files were already organized. Elise's ledger, photographed page by page, a reconstruction of the clearing, angles, positions, the arrangement of objects that meant nothing to anyone who hadn't seen them. My chronology cross-referenced with the edge session dates, the mapping connecting exclusions to formal procedures, showing how decisions in closed sessions became actions across the town's institutions. I drafted the email carefully. No emotion, no interpretation, just the facts arranged in the order that made them impossible to ignore. I sent the first copy to the Vermont State Police with a cover letter outlining what I'd found. A coordinated system of social exclusion operating across multiple institutions. Distributed responsibility preventing individual accountability. Formal procedures obscured behind informal arrangements. I named board members Beckett and Hawthorne, the latter confirmed as Eleanor Hawthorne, the keeper. Garrett and the crew foreman who redirected the trails, Marion at Town Hall, with her recording mechanisms and ledgers. Dr. Adler for her ambiguous autopsy findings. Pastor Jonah for his sermons about necessary stewardship. I named Hank. I sent the package to the state attorney general's office, then copies to the county prosecutor and the state medical examiner, each with a cover letter tailored to jurisdiction. My hands were steady. I expected them to shake. I attached photographs of the clearing, my detailed chronology, the mapping showing how exclusions aligned with edge session dates, and the names of everyone involved, from the board to the crew members who followed orders, because following was simpler than questioning. Then I wrote about Casey. I wrote that Casey was marked for exclusion, a teenager whose only mistake had been questioning the town's consensus during a civic forum. I outlined the pattern, subtle removals from social groups, whispered comments, the isolation that precedes departure, warned that the town's machinery was already in motion and that within weeks Casey would likely leave, recorded as a voluntary departure. Casey was still in town, still vulnerable, still at risk. I sent those emails at 11:47 p.m. The screen glowed, the cursor blinked in the empty field. I closed the laptop, sat back, and looked out at Main Street, where the streetlight cast long shadows. A car passed slowly, its headlights briefly illuminating the storefronts before disappearing toward the highway. I'd crossed a line. The exposure was formal and irreversible. The town's protective network would begin to collapse the moment someone at the Attorney General's office opened those files. Hank would face charges. Elise would face questions about her complicity in the record alterations. The board would be investigated.
The machinery that had operated in the shadows for decades would be dragged into the light. I thought of what Hank had said in the forest. That exposure would destroy the careful order, fracture the families he depended on, and transform Black Hollow from a functioning community into a site of accusation and retribution. He was probably right. The town as it was couldn't survive what I'd sent. But the town had been built on the systematic removal of people who didn't fit, on silence, complicity, and the rationalization that small betrayals were necessary for survival, on the word choose used to describe decisions made under systematic exclusion. The town deserved to collapse. I stood, wrapped my arms around myself, and watched the empty street from the window, waiting for whatever came next. The night stretched into morning without sleep. I watched the street from the window, tracking the occasional car and the traffic light cycling with no one to notice. Around 3, I stopped pretending I could rest, made coffee in the kettle, and sat at the desk with my phone. The state police arrived before dawn. I heard multiple vehicles pull into town, doors opening in sequence, the low murmur of coordinated movement. By the time I got downstairs, they'd spread through Black Hollow like a system activating. 2 cruisers blocked the intersection near Town Hall. A third sat outside the sheriff's office. At least 6 officers and windbreakers stood there, and 2 civilians moved with the deliberate authority of investigators. The desk clerk at the inn, Patricia, the same woman from the cafe, was on her phone, voice tight. She hung up when she saw me. "They are executing warrants," she said. I nodded. "I called them yesterday." Her face shifted to resignation. She didn't ask what I'd told them. By 7, they'd secured the town hall records room. I watched from across the street as they carried labeled, photographed boxes to a van. Marion Key stood in the doorway, pale, while an officer explained what they were taking. The warrant for Pastor Jonah's sermons and private documents came next. He arrived at his church office attached to the sanctuary and dropped his shoulders when he saw the officers. He didn't argue. He opened the door and stepped aside. At Dr. Adler's office on Maple Street, 2 investigators entered with the warrant while a uniform waited outside. Through the window, I saw Dr. Adler seated at her desk, hands folded, watching them. By mid-morning, they'd brought Garrett Holcomb in for a statement. He arrived at the sheriff's office in his truck, moving slowly, like a man walking toward the inevitable. They didn't cuff him, but escorted him inside with careful attention, as if they knew exactly what they were looking for. I stood near Elm and Main when Hank emerged. He'd already been inside when the warrant was served. An investigator walked beside him, not touching, but close enough to make the point. Hank's face was composed, though his jaw was tense, and his hands hung without their usual purpose. He'd turned over his records when asked. His briefcase clacked shut. He saw me. Our eyes met for a moment. Then he looked away and let the investigator guide him to an unmarked car. The machinery that had worked in mutual silence had become visible, not in dramatic confrontation, but through the methodical work of law enforcement. The monthly briefings that coordinated soft enforcement were now evidence. Elise's secret ledger was documentation of conspiracy. Hank's signed reports were material misrepresentations of missing person cases. Elise found me around noon. She'd been at the library when investigators arrived with a subpoena for her employment records and any documents about archive alterations. She was shaking, folded into herself outside the coffee shop where I'd waited. "They asked about the ledger," she said quietly. They knew what I did." "I gave them copies," I said. "I'm sorry. I should have told you first." She shook her head, eyes red. "I knew you would. When I gave it to you, I knew you'd do this." She paused. "I'm relieved. I'm terrified, but relieved." An officer passed us, heading toward Town Hall. Elise flinched. "They're going to charge people," she said. "Yes." "Including me." I didn't answer. There was nothing honest I could say. She'd been complicit and coerced. Investigators would sort those distinctions. That wasn't my responsibility anymore. By afternoon, they'd set up a temporary office in the administrative building and were taking statements from Edge crew members, town council staff, anyone who had contact with the exclusion machinery. I saw Rowan arrive around 2. He looked smaller than in the forest, diminished by the formality. The town had gone quiet, but not in its usual way. This wasn't the silence of complicity. It was shock. People realized the invisible had become visible, and the system they'd participated in was now under scrutiny. I stood in the town center, watching investigators move between buildings, officers secure evidence, law enforcement dismantle the machinery of exclusion. The town was collapsing, not suddenly, but under the inexorable weight of institutional process. Around 4, Agent Sarah Chen, lead investigator from the State Attorney General's office assigned to Black Hollow, approached me. Gray streaks ran through her dark hair. "You're Mara Sullivan," she said. "I am." "Thank you for coming forward. What you've documented is extensive and will be useful." She paused. "We've located Casey, the teenager you mentioned. We got to them before the exclusion escalated. They're safe and cooperating." Something in my chest released. "What happens now?" I asked. "We're going to build the case," she said. "We interview everyone, check the records, and decide on charges and who needs to testify." She glanced toward Town Hall. "Your notes about the clearing, the trail changes, and the ledgers show a deliberate plan. That shows coordination and intent. That's important evidence." "And people who were removed? The ones in the forest?" Her expression hardened. "We're reviewing those deaths with the medical examiner. If Adler altered findings to fit the town story, that will be part of what we examine." She left and walked back toward the administrative building. I stayed in the town center as afternoon light shifted. Investigators and officers continued their work. The town collapsed, one box, one statement, one piece of evidence at a time. The afternoon dissolved into evening, and I remained in the town center long after investigators consolidated their work into piles and sealed containers. The sun dropped behind the ridge, casting the municipal buildings in shadow. People moved past me on Main Street at the cautious distance of those who'd learned to avoid notice. A few stopped to stare. Most didn't. By the time I walked back to the inn, word had spread through Black Hollow like a rupture. The investigation wasn't theoretical anymore. State vehicles and officers taking statements. Seized records. Subpoenas served at homes and offices. The town's careful order was being dismantled piece by piece, and everyone could see it happening. I sat at my desk and waited. Around 9, the phone rang. Agent Chen. "I wanted you to know we've secured statements for most of the crew," she said without preamble. "Garrett Holm is cooperating. He's given us names and dates for who redirected people on the trails. He also turned over records showing cash payments that went through Town Hall with vague descriptions. That's useful." "What about Hank?" I asked. "Calder's attorney told him to cooperate. He's been handing over records all day. His calendar, letters with board members, notes from briefings. He's willing to testify about the deal he made with the board 20 years ago. Though his attorney is pushing for immunity on some counts in exchange for that testimony." I didn't respond. It was the only sensible choice, given what he'd done, but it didn't change that he'd done it. "There's something else," Chen continued. "We found additional remains in the forest, not recent. We're talking at least 3 people from 8 to 10 years back. Dr. Adler's office has done preliminary work, but they're being cautious. We've brought in our own medical examiner, so we'll have a clearer picture." "What about Casey?" I asked. "Safe. We located Casey before the exclusion escalated. The family is cooperating, and Casey's giving us a detailed account. The social isolation, the comments, the systematic removal from activities. It matches the pattern you documented." I closed my eyes. One person saved. One who wouldn't disappear into the forest or a distant city with nothing but the clothes on their back and the shame the town had pressed into them. "The keeper," I said. "Eleanor Hawthorne. Is she being charged?" "We're building the case. Hank's testimony about her directives is critical. We're also examining her financial records, evidence she controlled funding that incentivized compliance from town institutions, the pastor, the medical examiner, the town clerk. She created a system where cooperation was profitable and dissent costly." I thought about Eleanor Hawthorne, whom I'd known my whole life as a fixture of Black Hollow's social hierarchy. A descendant of the town's founders, her name appeared on buildings and in records. She'd orchestrated the removal of people from their homes and families with the same methodical care she'd used to plan a festival. "How long will the investigation take?" I asked. "Months, probably. We're examining decades of patterns. We need to distinguish between people who left by genuine choice and those who were forced. Some families are requesting searches for relatives who disappeared years ago and were never found. We're coordinating with other jurisdictions. This is larger than we initially thought."
After we hung up, I sat in the dark and listened to the town settle. Somewhere in Black Hollow, people were having conversations I couldn't hear. Some were deciding whether to cooperate with investigators or protect their neighbors. Some were realizing the order they'd believed in was built on something rotten. Some were grieving people they'd helped drive away. The next morning, I went to the library. Elise was at the front desk, rigid with tension, looking as though she hadn't slept. "They want me to testify," she said before I could speak. "The investigators, about the ledger. Who requested the alterations? What I changed and when."
"Yes," I said.
"I could be charged. My attorney says conspiracy to obstruct justice, falsifying public records."
I didn't tell her it would be all right. It wouldn't be. The consequences were coming. "You did the right thing," I said. "You gave them the evidence they needed."
"I did it because I was afraid," Elise said. "I kept the ledger because I was afraid of what would happen if I didn't have proof. I gave it to you because I was afraid of what would happen if I kept it. I'm still afraid."
"I know." She looked at me with eyes that had aged in the last 48 hours.
"Will you testify too? About how you got the ledger? About what I told you?"
"Yes," I said. "I'll testify." That afternoon, I walked to the forest edge where Rowan was clearing deadfall from the north trail, moving with the mechanical precision of someone trying not to think. When he saw me, he set his tools down. "They took my statement. 3 hours," he said. "They asked about Jordan's note, the people I'd seen in the forest, and when I knew."
"What did you tell them?"
"The truth. That I knew people were being pushed out. That I helped some of them. That I should have done more." He looked at the trees. "They're searching for bodies, bringing in dogs, organizing teams. They're going to find people in there." "Yes. I could have stopped it," Rowan said. "If I'd told someone earlier, if I'd been braver." "You're telling them now." "It's too late for most of them." He was right. It was too late for most of them. But it wasn't too late for the people still in Black Hollow, still vulnerable to the machinery that had consumed others. It wasn't too late to prevent the next Casey, the next person marked for exclusion. By week's end, the investigation consumed the town. Investigators conducted formal interviews with board members, with Dr. Adler, with Pastor Jonah. Subpoenas covered decades of records. The Attorney General's office opened a task force to examine the disappearances and whether charges beyond obstruction and conspiracy were warranted. The consensus that had held Black Hollow together fractured. Families of the missing demanded answers. Residents who'd participated in the soft enforcement began cooperating to reduce their own exposure. The careful silence that had protected the town secret became impossible to maintain. I stayed through it all, watching the town transform from a place of hidden cruelty into a place of visible reckoning. The inn's owner asked how long I planned to stay. I told her I didn't know. There were still questions to answer, still people to find or account for. One evening, as I was leaving the library, Lila Hart waited outside. "Look, Devin," she said, voice rushing in that familiar quick way. "They found him, not alive, down in the forest about 2 miles south of the clearing. Autopsy's happening now. They think he's been there maybe 5 years. I didn't know what to say. I'd suspected it. The investigation had been searching. Knowing something intellectually and hearing it spoken aloud were different things. "They're trying to figure out whether he died from exposure, injury, or something else," Lila added, her hands shaking now. "I'm sorry," I said. "Don't be sorry," Lila said. "Find out what happened to him. Find out who did this. That's what I want." The investigation would. It would take months, maybe longer. The machinery that drove Devin from his home into the forest would be exposed piece by piece, until everyone knew how it worked and who made it work. I walked back to the inn through streets that felt changed. The town looked the same, but the agreement that had held it together was gone. What would replace it, I didn't know. At least the truth was finally visible. Fractures of quiet. The State Protective Services office in Montpelier sat 3 floors above the street, fluorescent light and institutional beige.
Late spring had turned the capital into something almost pleasant. Trees leafed out, the air carrying a warmth that made people forget winter. I'd driven south from Black Hole that morning, 60 miles of highway that felt like another country. Casey arrived at intake around 10. I watched from the adjacent office, the kind of space designed so caseworkers could observe without being observed. The kid looked hollowed out, the way people do after weeks of realizing their own town had decided they didn't belong. Their clothes hung loose. There was a bruise on the left jaw, not fresh, maybe a week old, that no one had documented or asked about. The state social worker was Patricia Doyle, in her mid-50s, with the efficient manner that comes from processing dozens of cases. She sat with paperwork spread in front of her, asking questions as if they weren't questions. Name, age, last known address, any medical conditions, any medications, any injuries requiring attention. They answered in monosyllables. Yes, no, I don't know. Doyle made steady notes, checking boxes and filling dates, creating the official record that would turn Casey from a Black Hollow kid into a minor in protective custody, officially documented as at risk due to systemic social targeting. "We'll find you somewhere safe," Doyle said, the words practiced and small, as if saying them could make them true. "Your relatives in Burlington have agreed to take you. We'll have someone drive you up after lunch." Casey nodded. Just a nod. 2 days earlier, I'd testified in an interview room with Agent Sarah Chen and 2 other investigators, walking them through trail redirections, the hidden clearing, the documented preparations. I'd explained how the machinery worked, how it distributed responsibility across enough people that no one had to feel responsible, how it made exclusion look like a choice, how it turned a town into a system designed to push people out while maintaining the fiction they'd left voluntarily. They listened. Chen took notes while the others reviewed Casey's file. Statements from Rowan and Garrett, medical examiner records, all pointing to the same conclusion. Casey had been marked for removal, and the town had already begun the process. "We are not sending Casey back to Black Hollow," Chen said, blunt and low. "This is precautionary and permanent." By 11, Doyle finished the intake and walked Casey through what would happen. Transport to Burlington, the relative's home, follow-up visits, school enrollment. She spoke as if it were routine, because it was, and that's the problem. The machinery of Child Protective Services ran on cases like this. What made this different was that the danger wasn't a parent's addiction or a home without heat. It was a town, a coordinated system of people who'd decided, collectively and without saying it directly, that Casey needed to leave. By 1, Casey was gone. A Burlington caseworker had arrived and driven north with them in the passenger seat, toward relatives who'd agreed to take a kid they barely knew because the state asked, and because the alternative was leaving them in Black Hollow. I sat in the waiting area after they left, watching the light shift across the carpet. Doyle was already processing another file. There were always more. By late afternoon, the case file was sealed. I'd watched investigators compile Elise's ledger of requested alterations, photographs of the clearing, the crew's records showing redirected people on trails, and payments through town hall, building an official record toward the working theory. Forced psychological harm through coordinated social abandonment constitutes abuse, whether or not physical violence occurred. The sealed file's language was precise, not conspiracy or orchestration, but pattern, coordination, systematic. It documented the machinery without needing to prove intent. The harm was in how it functioned, in that it worked. Chen asked me to return to Montpelier the following week to give formal testimony, quietly in the hallway after the others left. "I need you to go over it on the record." "I need you to go over it on the record," she'd said. "Everything you found, the timeline, the connections, all of it." I agreed. There was no other choice. Sitting in the waiting area, I understood Casey's removal was only the beginning. The investigation would continue. The machinery would be exposed piece by piece. The people who'd operated it would face legal charges, professional ruin, and the irreversible fact of being known. I drove back to Black Hollow as afternoon turned to evening. The highway ran 60 miles to the town that had tried to solve its problems by making people disappear. I thought about Casey, somewhere north in a car with a stranger, headed toward a life unlike the one the town had been constructing for them. At least that part was done. At least the kid was safe. The drive back to Black Hollow gave me time to think, but it didn't help much. By the time I reached the town limits, the sun was dropping toward the ridgeline, and my phone had 3 missed calls, numbers I didn't recognize. I pulled into the motel lot and sat in the car, engine off, listening to the voicemail notifications. The first 2 were generic, reporters and someone from the state police. The third was different. Lila Hart's voice was tight and controlled, like someone holding herself together. "Mara, it's Lila. Look, I got a letter today from the Attorney General's office. They're calling it an investigation now. Not just the disappearances, the whole thing. The way people were pushed out. Devin, the others. They want me to send them information, medical records, anything that shows. I don't know. That it wasn't his choice?" She paused. "Call me back, hun, please." I replayed it, then called. She answered before the second ring. "You got one too?" she blurted, breathy, the chatty edge gone. "I thought maybe it was just me." "I'm back in Black Hollow," I said. "They briefed me this morning before I drove out." "So you knew they were sending these letters?" "I knew they were notifying families." Silence stretched until I thought the call had dropped. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. Not softer exactly, but different. Like someone watching a story they'd accepted for months suddenly shift shape in front of them. "They're calling it a pattern," she said, the word scraped out like it hurt. "The letter uses that word, pattern, not coincidence, not just bad luck or people making their own choices. They're saying the town did this, deliberately." I heard her breathing, uneven. "I know what the letter says," I told her. "Do you know what it means?" Her voice cracked. "It means they think someone made him leave. He didn't just walk away because he couldn't handle it anymore. They pushed him until he had no choice." "That's what the evidence suggests." "Then he might be alive," she said, the hope pitched thin and sudden. "They forced him out. He might have gone somewhere, living somewhere, thinking we didn't want him back, thinking we'd given up on him." I closed my eyes. Through the motel window, I could see the main street, storefronts dimming as businesses closed. Somewhere in town, people were reading letters that changed everything they thought they knew. "The letter asked me to send them information," Lila continued, hurried now. "Medical history, psychological evaluations, anything that shows he was targeted. They want to know if I think he left voluntarily or if he was driven out." "What do you think?" "I think my brother was a good person who didn't fit into what they wanted. I think they made his life impossible. If he's alive, we need to find him before he thinks he's been forgotten." I didn't tell her the letter invited families to submit theories about where their relatives might have gone, or that the state police were already coordinating with agencies in neighboring states. I didn't tell her the chances of Devin being alive in the absence they'd driven him into were so slim that hope might be the cruelest thing she could hold on to. Instead, I said, "Send them everything you have. Every document, every memory, every detail about what happened to him before he disappeared. Make them understand who he was." "Will you help me?" she asked, voice small now, the usual chatter folding into pleading. "Yes." She exhaled, a relief tinged with something else. The weight of knowing the investigation was real now, the machinery of the state was turning, and that none of it would bring her brother back. The weight of that phone call stayed with me through the night. I lay in the motel room, listening to the hum of the air conditioner and watching the numbers on the clock radio shift from 1 hour to the next. Sleep didn't come. I kept replaying Lila's voice at the end of the conversation. The shift from desperation to something harder, more determined. She was going to fight. The state was going to fight. And I was going to help them do it. By morning, the fracturing had become visible. I walked Main Street around 9, ostensibly to grab coffee from the diner, but really to see what a town looked like when its machinery began to break. The spring air still held winter's bite as the trees pushed out new leaves. The storefronts looked as they always had, painted signs, window displays. But something underneath had shifted. Marion wasn't at town hall. A woman at the front desk I didn't recognize told me Marion had been suspended, pending an investigation into her record-keeping. She sounded rehearsed. I nodded and left. There was no point in asking. The message was clear enough. The church parking lot was nearly empty when I passed. I'd expected more cars and the usual morning activity, but only a handful of vehicles dotted the lot. A notice on the bulletin board caught my eye. I didn't need to read it. Word had already spread. Pastor Jonah was taking a leave of absence. Administrative matters, a euphemism that fooled no one. At the hardware store, I ran into Derek Paulson, the owner, a second-generation local whose bids lived or died on council contracts. He was arranging paint cans with more focus than the task required. When he saw me, he straightened, a flicker of recognition or wariness across his face. "Morning, Mara," he said. "Derek, how's business?" He set the paint can down. "Slow. Damn slow for this time of year," he swallowed. "Look, about those jobs they flagged, I had no good choices. The board started handing out contracts to their people. Promised you nothing if you didn't fall in line. I tried to keep the doors open. It wasn't like I wanted it." I'd heard variations of that from 3 shopkeepers that morning, each delivered in the same quiet tone, as if speaking softly might make the admission less damaging, as if explaining could be a defense. "I understand," I said, because there was nothing else to say that wouldn't make it worse. "You do?" Derek asked. "I'm not sure anyone really understands what it's like, trying to keep a business when the rules change on you and nobody tells you the new rules." He wasn't wrong. Understanding didn't change what had happened. I left and continued down Main. The town's rhythm felt broken, like machinery with a bent gear. The synchronized confidence that had held everything, the unspoken agreement that certain things weren't discussed and certain people didn't belong, was fragmenting into something else, individual uncertainty. People stood alone in shops, offices, homes, suddenly aware the ground beneath them wasn't as solid as they'd believed. The Edge Crew's monthly meetings had been canceled indefinitely, Garrett told me, looking diminished, as if the cancellation had taken something out of him. They were supposed to be tomorrow night. Instead, nothing. An absence where routine used to be. I thought about Rowan, and why he'd handed me the map with shaking hands. About Garrett, who'd given investigators names, dates, and records of cash payments through Town Hall for work no one was supposed to acknowledge. About Hank, who'd broken and was now cooperating, turning over documents and preparing to testify against the system he'd helped build. The town was unraveling, not all at once, but in pieces. A suspension here, a leave there, a canceled meeting, a quiet conversation where someone framed their complicity as circumstance rather than choice. I stood at Main and Elm, watching people move through the streets. They looked smaller, diminished by the weight of exposure. The careful whispers of decades about who belonged, which families were acceptable, the machinery of exclusion, suddenly had nowhere to hide. The state investigation had pulled back the curtain. Now everyone stood in the light, trying to figure out how to exist where the darkness they'd relied on was gone. The forest floor was damp with recent rain. The smell of rot and new growth hung heavy in the clearing. I'd been at the edge for nearly an hour, watching state investigators. They moved with the methodical precision of people trained to treat landscape as evidence. Agent Chen had called 3 days after the town center fracturing began. She needed me to walk them through the clearing again and mark the positions of the objects I'd found. I had. Now they documented what I'd already seen. The watch, the photograph, the rope, the carved box, each shot from multiple angles, each given a reference number and a placard. A photographer crouched by the watch, adjusting his light. Another knelt by the rope, measuring it. Their movements were deliberate, almost ritualistic. This was how the state turned discovery into evidence. "Sullivan." Chen appeared beside me with a tablet. She looked tired. The kind of tired that came from cases where answers multiplied instead of narrowed. "The photograph matches a missing person from 2019, she said. "Rebecca Thorne. Disappeared from Rutland, about 40 miles south. The watch belonged to someone else, David Marsh, missing since 2016. The rope hasn't matched anything yet. We're still running comparisons." Something tightened in my chest. 2 people, years apart, ended up in this clearing. "How many?" I asked. "How many what?" "How many people are we talking about?" Chen scrawled. 5 confirmed matches so far. Could be more. We're still processing." A man I hadn't seen was examining the carvings at the clearing's perimeter. He wore glasses and carried a journal. Chen noticed me watching him. "That's Dr. Whitmore," she said, "folklorist from the university. We brought him in to analyze the carvings." Whitmore ran his fingers over a symbol, tracing it slowly, then made notes and moved to the next tree. He worked his way around the edge. After 20 minutes, he walked over to where Chen and I stood. He was in his mid-60s, with a careful manner that suggested a life spent studying what others overlooked. "They're copies," he said, "taken straight from a children's game manual, Finder's Game, 70s era. The manual used simple symbols to mark spots or pass notes between players." "Ritual symbols?" Chen asked. Whitmore shook his head. "No coherent ritual here. Whoever did this borrowed the imagery and laid it out, but there's no consistent belief system underlying it. Think of someone using familiar icons because they work visually, not because they carry any liturgy." He tapped a carved line. "What's notable is the care. These aren't casual scratches. The marks are repeated and refined, recut in places. Someone tended this site, came back, maintained it." Chen made a note. "How long would you estimate?" "I'd say at least 4 years, probably longer. The weathering and recarving point to sustained use, with activity definitely within the last year." After Whitmore returned to his documentation, Chen turned to me. "We're bringing in a soil analyst tomorrow. We need to establish a time frame of use, see when the site was first established." They continued their work as afternoon light shifted through the trees. They collected soil samples and photographed the layout from above to map positions. The clearing was being transformed from a place I'd found into state property. Cataloged, measured, cross-referenced against missing person databases. I thought about Whitmore's point. Maintenance, care, intention. This wasn't superstition or a random collection left by someone passing through. It was organized practice. Someone came here repeatedly and arranged these things with purpose. The question was why, and who. By the time the investigators packed up, the sun was low. Chen walked me back toward the trail. "We're going to need you to testify. Formal statement, timeline, everything you observed. We'll schedule it for next week in Montpelier." "All right." "And Sullivan, don't talk to anyone in town about what you've seen. Not yet. We're still building the case. The fewer people who know the details, the better." I nodded, though it was already too late. Lila Hart knew. Rowan Pierce knew. Hank Calder knew. The state had started interviews, and information moved through Black Hollow like water through fractured stone. The walk back to my car was quiet. The forest seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting to see what would emerge from the investigation's careful documentation. Behind me, the clearing stayed undisturbed, except for placards and the photographs that would enter the official record. The objects would be removed, taken to evidence storage, examined and re-examined. The site would be left empty, another patch of forest floor where something had happened and then stopped. But the carvings would remain, symbols on the trees, weathered and deliberate, waiting for someone else to find them and wonder what they meant. The courthouse in Montpelier felt colder than the forest. I'd driven south from Black Hollow in the early morning, the highway cutting through farmland indifferent to the small towns in the hills. The civil litigation filing chambers were on the second floor, a space of gray walls and fluorescent lights where families began to turn grief into legal documents. Agent Chen asked me to be present when the first suits were filed. She wanted a witness who understood the timeline and could speak to the pattern. I'd agreed without hesitation, though I hadn't expected the formality, the weight of legal language, the precision required to turn what I'd uncovered into claims a court could recognize. Lila Hart was already there, near the filing window with a folder clutched to her chest. She looked smaller than in Black Hollow, diminished by the setting. When she saw me, her shoulders straightened. "Look, they want everything. Medical records, school evaluations, psychological assessments," she said. "They want to show that Devin was functioning, that there was no legitimate reason for the exclusion." I nodded. That's how they build a pattern. Individual cases that shouldn't have happened, stacked together. "I've been on the phone with Devin's old doctor and his teachers," she said. Her voice was brittle. "Everyone's suddenly eager to help. 6 months ago, they wouldn't return my calls. Now they're calling back within hours." A clerk at the window gestured for us to approach. The filing was anticlimactic. Papers exchanged, fees paid, a receipt printed. When the clerk stamped the first complaint, something shifted. The allegations became official. The town's informal mechanisms, whispered campaigns, coordinated exclusions were now public record. Emotional distress, Lila read from her copy of the filing. Loss of consortium. Wrongful expulsion from community. She looked up at me. Is that even enough? It's a start, I said. The ledger helps. Elisa's documentation shows this wasn't random. It was coordinated. Lila's jaw tightened. I still don't understand how they thought they could get away with it. That no one would notice. They weren't hiding it from everyone, I said. They were hiding it from people like you, outsiders. Inside Black Hollow, everyone knew. It was never named. Over the next 2 hours, 3 more families filed suits. The Harts sued board members individually, the town council collectively, and the sheriff's department for negligent investigation and obstruction of justice. 2 other families filed similar complaints. The damages sought, emotional distress, loss of consortium, wrongful expulsion, were specific. Each filing was a small act of defiance against the town's narrative. I watched the board's legal strategy take shape in documents Chen had shared. Their defense was clear. They'd never formally documented decisions. All instruction was informal. Each party acted within its authority, a coordinated denial dressed as decentralization. But Elisa's ledger made that defense impossible. I'd seen the ledger myself, the shadow documentation she'd kept as insurance, initials matching board members, dates, explicit notations of who requested what and when. The entries were meticulous. Elise had recorded the machinery of exclusion as it operated, creating a parallel archive that contradicted the board's claims of informality. They're going to argue that she was acting on her own, Chen had told me, that she misrepresented requests, that she was paranoid about her job security. She wasn't paranoid, I said. She was documenting coercion. By late afternoon, I sat across from Chen in a small conference room on the 3rd floor. She had files spread across the table. The civil complaints, preliminary statements from witnesses, the forensic documentation from the clearing. Dr. Adler's contract isn't being renewed, Chen said. The county reviewed her autopsy wording and ruled professional negligence. They're distancing themselves from her findings. I felt sharp satisfaction, quickly replaced by something more complicated. Adler had been complicit, yes, but she'd also been trapped by the system. The need to cooperate, maintain relationships, survive within a structure that demanded compromise. What about Hank? I asked. Settlement talks are underway. His attorneys are minimizing his exposure by emphasizing his cooperation with the state investigation. Chen said dryly. The same cooperation you forced through exposure. I didn't respond. The truth was uncomfortable. I'd leveraged Hank's fear to get him to cooperate, and now his attorneys used that cooperation as a shield. The system absorbed even resistors, turning capitulation into evidence of reasonableness. The board claims they didn't know about the ledger, Chen continued. They say Elise acted independently, had a personal vendetta or mental health issue. She was protecting herself, I said. She knew what would happen if she didn't document everything. She was right. Chen leaned back. Elise will have to testify. She must explain why she kept the ledger, who she shared it with, what she understood about the request she recorded. She'll do it, I said. She knows what's at stake. So do you, Chen said. You'll have to testify too. How you obtained the ledger, what you understood of its significance, how you used it. I nodded. I'd known it would come. The moment I handed the ledger to Chen, I became part of the formal machinery. My investigation transformed into evidence, my conclusions into testimony. There's something else, Chen said, pulling out a photograph, an enlarged ledger page. Look at the initials here, here, and here. The pattern was unmistakable. The same initials recurring across months, requests, and types of alterations. The handwriting was consistent. The notations were specific. Eleanor Hawthorne, I said. The keeper, Chen confirmed. The ledger places her at the center. Hank's statements, Garrett's cooperation, the financial records, all trace back to her. The courthouse felt suddenly small. Hawthorne had orchestrated exclusion for decades. Now the machinery was being dismantled, filing by filing, statement by statement. The town's invisible architecture was becoming visible and vulnerable. "When do you need me back?" I asked. "Next week," Chen said. "We're scheduling depositions. Walk through your investigation chronologically, every step, every discovery, every moment you understood how the system worked." I thought of the clearing in the forest, the objects arranged with care, the carvings on the trees. I thought of Casey, now safe in Burlington, removed from the machinery that had forced them out. I thought of Devin Hart, still missing, a question mark in the official record. "I'll be ready," I said. The drive back to Black Hollow took 2 hours. I left Montpelier in the late afternoon, the courthouse receding behind me as I merged onto the highway heading north. The conference room where Chen had laid out the deposition schedule felt distant, though the weight of what she'd asked me to do remained concrete in my chest. I needed to return to the inn, pack what I'd accumulated over 2 months, and leave before the depositions began. The investigation would continue without my presence in town. The state had what it needed: the evidence, the timeline, the structural understanding of how the machinery had operated. What happened next belonged to lawyers, investigators, and the slow machinery of accountability. The landscape shifted as I drove. Montpelier's urban density gave way to smaller towns, then to the forest around Black Hollow. The roads narrowed. The sky opened. By the time I reached Main Street, the sun was low, casting long shadows across the storefronts. The Black Hollow Inn looked the same as when I'd arrived. The sign, the gravel lot, the quiet that seemed to emanate from the building itself, as though the place had learned long ago how to absorb sound and keep secrets. I parked in my usual spot and climbed to the second floor. My room was small and sparse: a bed, a dresser, a window overlooking Main and Cedar. I'd lived out of a suitcase the whole time, which made packing straightforward. I pulled the case from the closet and moved through the room the way I'd moved through it when I arrived. The notebook was in my jacket pocket. I took it out, held it for a moment, then placed it in the suitcase. The pages were filled with my handwriting, questions that had become answers, observations that had become evidence, fragments that had coalesced into a picture of how a town could organize itself around the systematic removal of people it deemed inconvenient. I folded my clothes and gathered the papers: maps, photocopies, notes from conversations, and packed the car the same way I'd unpacked it 2 months earlier. Except now it held conclusions instead of questions. Chen had made clear the state's inquiry had expanded: patterns across 3 decades, distinction between those who'd left voluntarily and those forced out, whether any missing had died under suspicious circumstances. The machinery was still turning, but now in the light instead of in shadow. My role was finished. I'd extracted the structure from darkness and handed it to people with authority to act. I'd ensured Casey's safety and forced the reopening of cases the town had considered closed. The rest belonged to the legal system. I stood at the window and looked down at the intersection below. The building stood unchanged. The streets ran the same paths. The town looked identical to when I arrived, yet bore no resemblance to what it had been. The consensus that had held it together, the shared agreement to believe in inevitable departures rather than imposed ones, had fractured under the weight of exposed truth. I understood now what Hank had feared. He told me that exposure would destroy the comfortable order that had taken decades to construct. He'd been right. The town's invisible architecture was becoming visible, and visibility meant vulnerability. The synchronized confidence that had held everything together was fragmenting into individual uncertainty. People were beginning to understand that choices they thought inevitable had been orchestrated. Hank had been right about the cost of exposure, and the destruction had been necessary. I turned from the window and finished packing. The car was loaded by the time the sun touched the horizon. I did a final walk-through: drawers, bathroom, making sure I hadn't left anything. The room looked empty, impersonal, ready for the next renter. I carried my suitcase downstairs.
The innkeeper wasn't at the desk, a young woman I didn't recognize working the evening shift. I left the key on the counter and walked to the lot. The evening air was cool. The sky deepened into that particular blue that comes just before dark. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment, looking back at the inn one last time. 2 months. That's how long it had taken to dismantle the machinery, to extract the structure from shadow into light, to give authorities the evidence they needed, to force the town to confront what it had become. I started the car and pulled out. The streets of Black Hollow passed by. The church where Pastor Jonah had framed exclusion as community care. The town hall where Marion had kept her ledgers. The storefronts where shopkeepers had participated in employment denial. The town was beginning to fracture, but that fracturing would continue long after I left. It wasn't my responsibility anymore. I drove north, away from Maine, away from the intersection where I'd spent 2 months watching the town from above. The forest closed in around the road. The last light faded. By the time I reached the highway, darkness had settled completely, and Black Hollow was behind me.
Lanterns in Black Hollow. I placed the room key on the dresser beside the empty glass, the glass I'd used each night to drink water that never quite settled my throat. It caught the morning light and made the room feel temporary. I'd already packed the rental car with the same methodical precision I'd used 2 months earlier. Now, the notebook in my jacket pocket held answers instead of questions. The investigation would continue without me. The state's inquiry had expanded to examine patterns across 3 decades, to distinguish voluntary departures from coerced ones, and to determine whether any missing had died under suspicious circumstances. But my role was finished. I pulled the door shut. The latch sounded definitive, a period rather than a pause. The hallway smelled of lemon cleaner and pine, the scent of careful maintenance, of someone downstairs relearning to move quietly through their building. I heard the innkeeper below, the soft creak of floorboards and the absence of conversation. The town had learned silence in the past weeks, not the comfortable silence of routine, but the kind that comes from watching what they'd built fracture under the weight of exposed truth. I went to the corner window one last time. Main and cedar spread below, the intersection where I'd stood countless mornings watching the town's rhythm break. The building stood unchanged. The streets followed the same paths. But the consensus that had held everything together, the shared agreement to believe in inevitable rather than imposed departure, had fractured irreparably. The storefronts looked smaller, or I simply stopped seeing them as I had when I arrived. I thought about Lila Hart and how her voice changed when she called after receiving the Attorney General's letter. Not anger exactly, but the sound of someone watching a story she'd accepted for months, suddenly reframed. Devon's ostracism, the exclusion from contracts, the whispered campaigns that preceded the disappearance. All were now officially recognized as part of a pattern rather than unfortunate coincidence. She'd asked if Devon might be alive somewhere, living in the absence they'd been driven into. I told her the investigation was expanding, re-examining cases the town had long considered closed. It wasn't an answer, but it was something. The town below bore no resemblance to the orderly facade I'd arrived at 2 months earlier. Yet it looked identical. I understood what Hank had feared. Exposure would destroy the comfortable order that took decades to construct. He'd been right, and the destruction had been necessary. I checked the satchel one final time. Copies of statements were sealed. My notes had been reduced to summaries and chain of custody receipts. Everything was in order. Everything was ready for Agent Chen in Montpelier, where I'd give formal testimony and walk investigators through the timeline I'd reconstructed. Depositions would follow. Litigation had already begun. Families had filed civil suits against board members, the town council, and the sheriff's department for negligent investigation and obstruction. Elise's ledger, the shadow record she'd kept like insurance, made their defense untenable, with initials, dates, and explicit notes of who requested what alterations and when. I closed the satchel and picked it up. Its weight felt appropriate. Evidence was heavy, truth heavier, and the decision to expose it heaviest. At the top of the stairs I paused. The innkeeper was quiet. A radio played somewhere in the kitchen, a voice reporting weather or news from a world outside Black Hollow. I descended slowly, footsteps deliberate. She emerged from the back hallway as I reached the lobby, a woman whose name I never quite learned, whose face had grown more lined over the past 2 months as she watched her town come apart. "Leaving already, are you?" she said. "This morning," I replied. She nodded as if she expected it. "Room was clean. You kept things quiet." "Thank you," I said. She didn't reply. She watched me move toward the door, hands folded, expression neutral. I wondered what she knew, what she'd heard, what role she played in the town's machinery, but I didn't ask. My questions had been answered. My investigation was complete. Morning air hit me as I stepped outside. It was already warm, the early summer heat that promised discomfort before noon. The parking lot was nearly empty. A few cars belonged to guests passing through without knowing what lay beneath the town's surface. My rental sat where I'd left it, packed and ready. I placed the satchel on the passenger seat, started the engine, and pulled smoothly out of the lot. I drove north, away from Maine and the intersection where I'd spent 2 months watching the town. The forest closed around the road. Morning light faded as I drove deeper, and by the highway the town was behind me, receding into the distance like something never quite real. The highway stretched north, and I watched the rearview mirror until Black Hollow faded. The road opened into wider country, less forest, more sky. I'd driven this route twice before, always heading away. This time felt different. The investigation had moved beyond me, into the machinery of state oversight and formal proceedings. I'd given my statements, evidence, and timeline. What happened next belonged to Chen and her team. By midday, after a 40-minute drive, I pulled into Montpelier, parked near the Attorney General's office on State Street, and paused before going inside. The building was unremarkable, brick and modest, the kind of place where bureaucracy happens. I gathered my notes and the copies I'd brought. Chen already had everything electronically. The papers felt like insurance. The waiting room smelled like coffee and paper. A receptionist checked me in and directed me to a conference room on the 2nd floor. Chen was already there, along with a court reporter and a man I didn't recognize, Assistant Attorney General Marcus Webb, according to the introduction. Coffee, water, and notepads were set out. The formality made the moment feel significant and oddly hollow. "Mara, thank you for coming in," Chen said, gesturing to the chair across from her. "We are going to walk through your timeline and your findings. Everything you say is being recorded. You understand that?" "I do." "And you understand that you may be called to testify in court, depending on how the investigation proceeds?" "Yes." Webb opened a folder. "Start with your initial contact with Lila Hart. Walk us through that conversation." I went through the sequence. Lila's letter, the diner meeting, Elisa's ledger, Rowan's map, the clearing, the remains. I spoke steadily, facts only, in order. They asked specific questions, dates, times, who said what, where documents came from, how I'd verified information. Webb took notes. The court reporter captured every word. "You named Eleanor Hawthorne as the keeper in your report," Webb said. "Walk us through how you identified her." I explained the genealogical research, property records, and family ties to the town's founding. The pattern suggesting authority and influence. It wasn't definitive, but it was substantial. "We've confirmed that identification," Chen said. "Her home was searched yesterday. We found correspondence, ledgers, and financial records that corroborate your assessment." I nodded. I'd expected they'd find evidence. The question was what they'd do with it. The deposition ran 4 hours. By the end, the afternoon light had shifted, and the office felt tired. Webb closed his folder and looked at me. "You did thorough work," he said. "The kind of work that typically takes law enforcement weeks to accomplish. You did it in 2 months. "I had motivation," I said. "You did, and now we have jurisdiction. The investigation is expanding. We've already recovered additional remains from the area you identified. We're executing warrants, conducting interviews, and building a prosecutorial timeline. You'll be called to testify, probably multiple times, in multiple contexts. Are you prepared for that?" "Yes." "It won't be pleasant," he went on. "The defense will try to pick your work apart. They'll say you were biased, that you mishandled things, that you had a personal stake. They'll press hard." "I know." "But your work is solid, and your testimony will be essential." He paused. "The town is going to change because of what you've done. Some people will be prosecuted. Others will lose their positions, their reputations, their standing. That's the consequence of what you've exposed." I understood that, and I understood it from the beginning. The question wasn't whether the town would change. It was whether the change would matter to the people who'd already been lost. Chen walked me out. In the hallway, she said quietly, "Casey's in Burlington with relatives. We've sealed the case file and filed a protective custody order. It's indefinite. Investigators are still searching for Devin Hart and the others, but Casey is safe." "Good." "You should go home," Chen said. "Rest. We'll be in touch about testimony scheduling. But for now, you've done what you came to do." I left and walked back to my car. The street was busy with people moving between offices and lunch spots. Normal life went on around me. I sat, gripped the wheel, feeling the last 2 months settle into my shoulders. The investigation would continue. Trials would come. The town would have to reckon. But that was no longer my work. It belonged to the system now. I started the engine, pulled onto State Street, and headed for the highway. Montpelier receded behind me. Ahead, the road opened into distance. Somewhere between Montpelier and the state line, the weight of the last 4 hours began to lift. My shoulders ached from sitting rigid in the conference room chair. Marcus Webb's questions had been methodical, precise, the kind that left no room for anything but fact. I had walked through the timeline, the evidence, the connections. By the end, my voice was hoarse. The road was empty. I passed through small towns that had nothing to do with Black Hollow, and felt relief in their indifference. But my mind circled back. The deposition was over, but not finished. Webb had made that clear. There would be depositions from the other side. Lawyers for Hank, the board, the town. Cross-examinations. Trials. Months away, maybe longer. The investigation would continue without me, but it wouldn't let me go. The system had me, too. I took the exit toward Black Hollow without planning to. The decision happened between mile markers, my hands turning the wheel before I'd decided. I needed to see the town again. Not to say goodbye. I'd already done that. But to mark the difference between what it had been and what it was becoming. The late morning light was shifting. I drove down Main Street slowly, noting the changes since that morning. The storefronts looked the same, but the air felt different. Lighter, or just emptier. I pulled the rental to the curb 2 blocks from Hank's office. The blinds were half drawn, as that morning, but now the space behind them was truly vacant. No movement, no sense of occupation. He was gone, not just from the office, but from the town's machinery. The state investigators had made sure. I sat with my hand on the wheel, looking at the half-drawn window. Hank had cooperated, handed over records, given statements, agreed to testify. It might spare him the worst, but it had cost him everything else. The badge, the authority, the identity he'd worn so long it had become indistinguishable from his skin. I thought about knocking, seeing if he was still inside, clearing out the last of his things. But there was nothing to say that didn't belong in a report. Everything between us had been documented and filed. The personal part was over. The clean line surprised me. Once I'd tried to soften endings with gestures or a conversation, convinced they'd mattered. In the last 2 months, I'd learned they didn't. Endings needed to stand as they were, clear, unambiguous, final. I turned the key and pulled back onto the street. The town rolled past my windows, familiar and foreign at once. I didn't look back at Hank's office. The town dissolved behind me as the road curved north toward the state boundary. 20 minutes of driving carried me past the last scattered houses. The turnoff locals avoided, the mile marker where the forest thickened. The shift from managed to wild was so gradual you'd miss it if you weren't paying attention. I was. I pulled into the north gate pull-off at Edge Wall without planning to. Gravel crunched under the tires. I sat a moment, hands on the wheel, looking at what the town had marked as its boundary. The river rock predated us, arranged decades ago in a line that followed the water's path. Carved posts stood at intervals, weathered, their surfaces etched with symbols that had meant something once. I stepped out and studied the runes, precise and deliberate, the kind of marks you make when you want something to last. They meant only what collective belief gave them: postings, erased votes, calls placed without minutes, procedures wrapped in the language of tradition and necessity. The runes were the visual anchor, making exclusion look natural, as if it had always been there. Wind moved through the trees at the forest edge and caught me the way it had when I was a child. I used to think the trees spoke, that if I listened hard enough I could understand. I stood, letting the sound wash over me, and now registered it as air and leaves, indifferent to runes or regulations, or who we pushed beyond the line. New state placards hung at the gate. I read the regulations printed in precise letters. No loopholes, no room for local interpretation. The language was clean and absolute. The language of order rewritten from the outside, of a system finally seen and being dismantled by outsiders. I thought about Hank, Eleanor Hawthorne, the family matriarch and a senior voice on the board, and all the small decisions that had accumulated into something monstrous. Casey already gone to Burlington, Lila still waiting for answers about Devon, Rowan diminished by what he'd witnessed and finally admitted. Order could be rewritten, and was. The question was whether those who'd built the old order would face what they'd done or spend their lives insisting it had been necessary. I turned to the car. There was nothing left for me in Black Hollow. The investigation would continue without me. Testimony would come later in Montpelier, where facts under oath would make their weight undeniable. But that was future work. For now, I needed to drive north, to put distance between myself and the place where I'd learned how a town could decide to erase people and call it community care. I pulled back onto the road and didn't look in the mirror. The highway north was empty in the early summer light. I'd made roughly 30 miles when it hit me. Elise was still in Black Hollow, at the library, still processing the ledger that had undone the town's machinery. I pulled off at a rest area outside Woodstock and sat with the engine off. The silence felt wrong. I'd spent weeks building the case, collecting statements, moving evidence through official channels. The investigation now belonged to Agent Chen and Marcus Webb, to the Attorney General's office. My role was documented, my testimony scheduled. But Elise had given me the ledger, knowing what it would cost her. I turned the car around. The drive back took 40 minutes. The library parking lot was nearly empty, just a handful of cars. I climbed the front steps and stopped at the glass doors, hand raised but not touching. Through the glass I saw her at the circulation desk. She stood with shoulders squared, hands moving with a precision that looked earned. She was labeling boxes, uniform boxes, and each one received a label printed with the state letterhead. Attorney General's Office. Long-term record storage. Case reference numbers that meant nothing to anyone but the investigators. The gaps she'd kept as protection were being converted back into records. Every deletion she'd logged in her shadow ledger, every alteration she'd noted in margins and private notes, was now reversed and formalized. The boxes would go to Montpelier, sit in a climate-controlled facility, and become part of the permanent record of what Black Hollow had done. She didn't know I was there. I watched. The way she checked each label twice before pressing it down, then moved to the next box without hesitation. No tremor in her hands, no visible fear. I pushed through the doors. She looked up. Something shifted in her face. Not surprise exactly, recognition maybe. She set down the label gun and straightened. "You came back," she said. "I got 30 miles north and realized I hadn't said anything to you." She glanced toward the back where the head librarian's office door was closed. "I'm finishing the last boxes. They're picking them up this afternoon. How are you holding up?" She picked up the label gun again, turning it over. "I'm terrified," she said. "Every time I picture the hearing, I hear the questions, and I hear myself saying them." "You did the right thing." "The right thing will cost me," she said. "I know that. But if I hadn't kept that ledger, if I hadn't given it to you, those boxes would be empty. The town would have won. I couldn't live with that." I leaned against the desk. "When you testify, tell the truth. Answer the questions. Don't apologize. Don't soften it. Will you be there? I'll be testifying too. Different hearing, probably, but yes. She nodded and returned to the boxes, hands steady. I watched her label another, press it down, move to the next. The library held a silence like a held breath. What you carry now is the proof you saved, I said, not just the cost. She didn't answer right away. She finished the box in front of her and set it aside. When she spoke, her voice was steady and soft, the way she always sorted difficult news into simple facts. There's a saying in the archives. Records keep the account when memory fails. I hope that's enough to matter. I stayed until the boxes were finished. We didn't talk much. There wasn't much left that wouldn't be said under oath. I stayed while she worked, and the morning light moved across the desk. When the last box was labeled and stacked, she looked at me. Thank you for coming back, she said. I nodded and turned toward the doors. The square beyond the glass was beginning to fill with the ordinary movement of a town learning, slowly and with difficulty, to be something other than it had been. I didn't know what that would look like, or if it would hold, but Elise would be here to see it, carrying the weight of what she had chosen to remember. I drove north again, and this time I didn't stop. The road north stretched empty. I had driven past the library square and kept going. The town's edges thinning into forest and then into the kind of silence that comes when you leave something behind that you know will never quite leave you. The morning warmed, early summer heat settling into the asphalt. I had not planned to stop again, but my hands found the turn toward Black Hollow Church without asking permission from the rest of me. The parking lot sat nearly empty. A few cars clustered near the entrance, but the nave doors remained closed despite the midweek hour. I pulled to the edge and cut the engine, then looked at the notice board beside the doors. A flyer announced community forums moderated by county facilitators in place of sermons. The lettering was clean, official. Older announcements hung beneath, edges curled, dates long past. I sat with my hands on the wheel and thought about the words that had once made this town sound like something other than it was. Stewardship, care, accord. The language had been a sedative, smoothing the edges of what was happening underneath. People spoke them in meetings and from the pulpit. The words made machinery sound like morality, turned exclusion into community protection and disappearance into choice. If anything in me had wanted to forgive that ease, the way language could reshape harm into something manageable, it no longer did. The investigation hadn't found a single person or moment to pin the murder on, but it had named harm, traced the pattern, connected the dots the town had spent years erasing. I got out of the car and walked to the edge of the lot where I could see the nave doors clearly. The parking lot was quiet. No music, blessing, or ritual softened my thoughts. In that quiet, the naming felt like the nearest thing to the work of truth being done. Not finished, I knew that, but completed in the way that mattered. The investigation, the depositions, the courts would continue at their own pace, but the story had been told, the pattern exposed. The town would have to look at itself now without the language to look away. I turned back toward my car and saw a figure by the entrance. For a moment I didn't recognize him. Then I did. It was Hank. He stood with his hands at his sides, watching. His uniform was still pressed, but he wore it differently, as if it no longer fit. He didn't approach. Neither did I. "You came back," he said across the empty lot. "I didn't plan to," I said. He nodded slowly. "Forums start next week. County's taking over the spiritual stuff. Figured you'd want to hear it." "I don't need to know," I said. "No, I suppose not," he said. We stood with the closed doors between us and the town. I saw the weight in his shoulders, the way his jaw had tightened, like a man who had finally stopped holding something up and was adjusting to the fall. "I gave them everything," he said. "Files, comms, everything on my desk." "I know." "It wasn't supposed to go this far," he said. "It wasn't meant to blow up like this." "What wasn't supposed to become what?" I asked. "A town that hurt people? Or a town that got caught?" He didn't answer. Silence stretched between us like something physical. "I'm leaving," I said. "I'm not coming back." "I know," he he said. "I can see that." I walked back, opened the driver's door. Before getting in, I looked back. He stood in the same spot, hand raised as if to gesture, then stopped. "The people you hurt," I said, "they're not coming back either. That's the part you need to understand. This isn't about you. It never was." I got in and started the engine. In the rear view, I watched him lower his hand. He stood alone in the parking lot as I pulled onto the road. I didn't look back. The road curved away from Black Hollow. The town shrank in my rear view until the church steeple vanished beneath the ridge. The guardrail marked the boundary between asphalt and the drop to the valley. Forest pressed in from both sides, indifferent, the landscape that had watched the town's machinery for decades. My notes lay closed on the passenger seat where I'd left them an hour ago. The phone vibrated once, a Montpelier number confirming receipt of final uploads. I didn't need to read it. Casey's file had been updated to stable placement. The language was bureaucratic, clean. It meant a kid was safe in Burlington with relatives, away from the architecture of exclusion that had nearly consumed them, and that the immediate threat was contained. The second notification came as I navigated a curve. Lila's name on a docket for a civil pre-hearing. She'd be deposed, forced to sit across from lawyers and repeat the story of her siblings' disappearance, how the town had erased them, how people stopped speaking their name. I'd be there too, testifying about what I'd found in Elise's ledger and the pattern it showed. We'd both witnessed the unraveling. I tightened my grip on the wheel. These were the kinds of closures that never felt like endings, more like solid ground after the water receded. The case had moved from my hands into the machinery of the state. Depositions, warrants, re-examinations of deaths signed off too easily. Agent Chen was coordinating it all now, building toward accountability. But accountability wasn't the same as resolution. It was just the beginning of a longer process. What remained in my mind reduced to essentials: pattern recognized, the edge sessions, marker redirections, ledger deletions, mechanism exposed. Eleanor Hawthorne, matriarch and longtime keeper of the board, had orchestrated those decisions from behind the scenes, with Hank executing them and the town council formalizing them into policy. The immediate target was safe. Casey, gone, protected, out of reach. The rest belonged to long processes now. Lawyers, judges, and the people who would have to live with what their town had done. The valley opened ahead, fields and tree lines stretching to the horizon. I'd spent weeks in Black Hollow learning its rhythms, its silences, the way people's eyes moved when they lied. Now I was leaving it behind, and the leaving felt like the only honest thing I'd done since arriving. I thought about Hank standing alone in the parking lot, his hand raised, then lowered. He'd given them everything: records, statements, cooperation. He'd broken with Hawthorne and turned over the mechanisms that had kept the town running. It wouldn't save him or any of them, but it would make the record clear, and the clarity was all I could offer those erased from it. The road straightened. The town was gone, hidden behind the ridge, the forest, and the distance I was putting between myself and the place. I didn't feel relief. I felt the weight of what I was leaving behind. Not the town itself, but the people still there who would have to reckon with what had been done in their names. Elise with her ledger and subpoena, Rowan with guilt over Jordan's note, Garrett and his crew facing investigators, families of the missing waiting for answers that would take months or years. I closed my notes and slid them into the satchel at my feet. The phone lay silent. The road descended toward the valley, and I pressed the accelerator, letting the distance grow. The road curved north. The valley fell away behind me. The sun had climbed higher, burning off the haze that had softened the ridgeline an hour earlier. I passed a sign for a rest area 2 miles ahead and took the exit without deciding. Muscle memory pulled the wheel as my mind caught up. The turnout faced a stand of maples, their leaves still fresh with early summer. I cut the engine and rolled down the windows. Warm air smelled of sap and road dust, with faint truck exhaust from the highway. The hood ticked as it cooled. I sat with my hands on the wheel, measuring what the case had taken and what it had given. The fear I had carried into Black Hollow, that I'd be the outsider who burned down the careful order of a place that had felt adjacent to home, who would unmake something, was real. It had made me cautious at first, made me second-guess every question. But midway through, I'd stopped fearing the burn. I had chosen it, and learned I could live with the ash. The forest on the horizon no longer held omens. It held trees, just trees, distinct and ordinary against the sky, with no weight of meaning pressing down. The town behind me would relearn weather, have seasons again rather than the climate of its own making. That was not my work to finish. That belonged to the people still there. Elise, Rowan, Lila, and the others who would have to learn to live in a place forced to tell the truth about itself. I turned the key. The engine settled into its idle. The map that had lived in my head for weeks, every street in Black Hollow, every trail marker, every link between people and the machinery that moved them, had gone quiet. The story was finished enough to leave, unfinished enough to go on without me. I pulled onto the highway and drove north, the maples receding in the mirror, the road opening ahead.